when she wouldn't run. The Montana sun beat down on a scene that would haunt Ethan Cole for the rest of his life. A wrecked stagecoach bleeding into the dust, bodies scattered like broken dolls, and in the center of it all, a woman who should have been running. Clara Whitfield knelt in the dirt, rocking a screaming infant against her chest, her dress soaked with blood that wasn't hers. Around her lay 3 corpses and the shattered remains of someone's journey west. When she looked up at the lawman approaching on horseback, her eyes held something fiercer than fear. She wasn't a victim. She was a promise keeper, and that changes everything. If you're watching from Texas, Colorado, New York, or anywhere across this country, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you believe some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost, hit that like button and stay with me until the end. The vultures had already started circling when Ethan Cole first spotted the wreckage. He'd been tracking the Garrett gang for 3 weeks, following a trail of blood and burned homesteads from the Wyoming border down through the Montana high country. The outlaws were getting desperate, their raids becoming sloppier, more violent. Ethan had seen what desperation did to men who'd already crossed too many lines. It made them dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with the fact that they had nothing left to lose. But he hadn't expected this. The stagecoach lay on its side like a dying animal, one wheel still spinning lazily in the hot wind. The horses were gone, cut loose or stolen, he couldn't tell yet. What he could tell, even from 200 yards out, was that whoever had hit this coach hadn't left witnesses. Except one. She was a dark shape against the pale dirt, kneeling beside the wreckage with her back to him. Even at this distance, Ethan could see the way her shoulders curved protectively around something she held. The crying reached him a moment later, thin and desperate, the sound of an infant who'd been screaming for too long. His hand moved to the rifle on his saddle, a habit born from too many years of finding scenes exactly like this one. But something made him pause. The woman wasn't moving with the frantic energy of someone freshly traumatized. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. She was doing something, not just surviving something. Ethan urged his horse forward, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks, for any sign that the men who'd done this were still nearby. The approach was textbook, circle wide, come in from the high ground. Never silhouette yourself against the sky. By the time he was close enough to see details, he'd already counted 3 bodies and confirmed what his gut had been telling him. The Garretts had been here. Their signature was all over the scene. Quick, brutal, efficient. Take what you can carry, burn what you can't, and leave nothing breathing that might point the law in your direction, except they had left something breathing. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from days of trail dust and not enough water. "Ma'am, I'm a deputy United States Marshal. I need you to show me your hands." She didn't startle. That was the first thing that struck him as wrong. A woman who'd just survived a massacre should have jumped at the sound of a strange voice. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her face coming into profile against the harsh afternoon light. "I can't," she said. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. "If I move my hands, the baby will fall." Ethan dismounted, keeping his rifle low but ready. Up close, the scene was worse than he'd thought. The driver was sprawled across the coach's side, a bullet hole in his temple. A well-dressed man in a city suit lay face down 10 feet away, his pockets turned inside out. And closest to the woman, barely 3 feet from where she knelt, was another woman, younger, maybe 25, her traveling dress torn and darkened with blood that had soaked into the Montana clay. "How long ago?" Ethan asked, his eyes still moving, still cataloging, still looking for threats. 2 hours, maybe 3. The woman, Clara, though he didn't know her name yet, shifted slightly, adjusting her grip on the baby. They took the strongbox, the mail, everything of value. Then they rode north. Ethan finally let himself look at her directly. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair coming loose from pins that had once held it in a respectable bun. Her dress was simple, well-made but not fancy, the kind a schoolteacher or a shopkeeper's daughter might wear. The blood on it was spray pattern, not pooled. She'd been close when someone died, but she hadn't been the one bleeding. "You were on the coach," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. They let you live. Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quick to name. They didn't let me anything, Marshall. They didn't see me. I was... She paused, and for the first time, her voice wavered. I was hiding. Under the seats. I'm not proud of it, but I was hiding, and they didn't check carefully enough, and by the time I came out, they were gone. The baby's crying had subsided to exhausted whimper. Clara, and Ethan had started thinking of her as Clara without knowing why, looked down at the child with an expression that was equal parts tenderness and devastation. This is Sarah, she said quietly. Her mother was Emily Brennan. She was traveling to meet her husband in Helena. He's a mining engineer. They were going to start a new life together, the three of them. Were, Ethan repeated. Were. Clara's jaw tightened. Emily died about an hour ago. She took a bullet in the ambush, but it was slow. She had time to... She asked me to take care of Sarah, to make sure she got to her father. She made me promise. And there it was. The thing that had been nagging at Ethan since he'd first spotted her from a distance. A normal person, a sensible person, would have run. The Garretts had left her alive by accident, which meant if they realized their mistake, they'd come back to fix it. Any survivor with half a brain would have put as much distance between themselves and this killing ground as possible. But Clara Whitfield had stayed, for a promise made to a dying woman, for a baby that wasn't hers. You should have left, Ethan said, and heard the accusation in his own voice. You should have taken the baby and run for the nearest town. Clara looked up at him then, and Ethan felt something in his chest shift at the expression in her eyes. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was something harder, something that had made decisions and learned to live with them. I know, she said simply. But I gave my word, and besides, she glanced down at the tiny face nestled against her shoulder. Sarah needed someone. She'd already lost everything else. I wasn't going to let her lose the one person who'd promised to keep her safe. Ethan crouched down, finally lowering the rifle all the way. This close, he could see the fine tremor in Clara's hands, the exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes. She'd been running on pure will for hours, and that will was starting to fray. What's your name? He asked. Clara Whitfield. Where were you headed, Clara? Bozeman. I was going to take a position as a teacher. She said it like she was talking about something that had happened to someone else in some other lifetime. I don't suppose that matters much now. It matters. Ethan stood, making his decision. We can't stay here. If the Garretts realize they left a witness, they'll circle back. Can you ride? Clara looked at him, then at the baby, then at the bodies surrounding them. I don't have much choice, do I? No, ma'am, you don't. It took 20 minutes to prepare. Ethan wrapped the bodies in canvas from the wrecked coach, weighing them down with rocks. It wasn't a burial, not proper, but it was the best he could do. Clara watched in silence, still holding Sarah, her face unreadable. We'll send someone back, Ethan told her. Once we reach town, they deserve better than this. Everything deserves better than this, Clara said quietly. Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He fashioned a sling from one of the blankets they found in the wreckage, showing Clara how to secure the baby against her chest so she'd have both hands free to ride. Sarah had finally cried herself to sleep, her tiny fist clutched in the fabric of Clara's blood-stained dress. You ever ridden astride? Ethan asked. No. Clara looked at his horse with something that might have been trepidation. But I'm guessing this isn't the time for propriety. No, ma'am, it's not. He helped her mount, his hands careful and impersonal, and swung up behind her. It was going to be a long, uncomfortable ride to Bear Creek, the nearest town, but it beat staying in a place where death hung so thick you could taste it. They rode in silence for the first hour. The sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Beautiful country, Ethan thought, for such ugly work. How long have you been tracking them? Clara's voice startled him out of his thoughts. The Garretts? 3 weeks, give or take. Will you catch them? It was a fair question, delivered without any particular emotion. Ethan considered his answer carefully. Eventually. Men like that, they always make a mistake. They get cocky or desperate or just plain tired, and when they do, I'll be there. Is that what you do? Chase bad men until they make mistakes? There was something in her tone that made him look down at the back of her head, at the dark hair catching the late sunlight. That's one way to put it. Must get lonely. Sometimes. The admission surprised him. But somebody's got to do it. If we all waited for someone else to stand up to the men who take what they want and leave bodies behind, there wouldn't be much civilization left to speak of. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Emily, Sarah's mother. She said something before she died. She said she wasn't afraid of dying, but she was terrified of Sarah growing up alone. Terrified that her daughter would never know she was wanted, that she was loved. You promised to tell her, Ethan guessed. I promised to show her. Clara's hand moved to cover the baby's back, protective and gentle. A child shouldn't grow up thinking they were a burden. Everyone deserves to know they mattered to someone. Something in those words hit Ethan harder than it should have. He'd spent most of his adult life in the territories, watching the West get settled one violent incident at a time. He'd seen plenty of death, plenty of loss. But he'd seen precious little of whatever it was that made someone like Clara stay in a killing field because a dying woman had asked her to protect a child. You always this stubborn about keeping promises? He asked, aiming for light and landing somewhere closer to genuine curiosity. Always. There was no humor in it, just fact. My father used to say that the only thing a person really owns is their word. Everything else can be taken from you, your money, your home, your life, but what you promise, what you choose to honor, that's yours. Nobody can take that unless you give it away. Sounds like a good man. He was. Past tense again, Ethan noted. He died when I was 16. Cholera outbreak in St. Louis. My mother followed him 6 months later. I think she just didn't want to be here without him. I'm sorry. Don't be. They had something most people spend their whole lives looking for. They had each other, completely, without reservation. If I'm lucky, I'll find a fraction of what they had. If I don't, she shrugged, the movement careful so as not to disturb the baby. At least I'll know what it looks like. At least I won't settle for less and call it love. The sun was nearly down when they finally saw the lights of Bear Creek in the distance. It wasn't much. A main street with maybe 20 buildings, a church, a saloon, and a handful of homes scattered on the outskirts. But it had a telegraph office and a doctor, and right now, that was all that mattered. Ethan guided the horse toward the doctor's house, a neat white building at the edge of town with lamplight glowing warm in the windows. He dismounted first, then helped Clara down, his hand spanning her waist as she carefully protected the baby. For a moment, they stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could smell the dust and blood, and underneath it, something that was just her. Then Clara stepped back, and the moment broke. Thank you, Marshal, she said formally, for getting us here safely. Ethan, he corrected without thinking. My name's Ethan Cole. Thank you, Ethan. She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did. You'd have figured something out. And he meant it. Looking at Clara Whitfield, blood-stained and exhausted, still holding another woman's child like her life depended on it, Ethan had the strangest certainty that this was a woman who would figure things out, no matter what the world threw at her. The doctor, a gruff man named Patterson who'd seen worse and probably expected to see worse again, took charge of Sarah with professional efficiency. He had a wife, thank heaven, a round-faced woman named Martha who clucked over the baby and promised to find milk and clean clothes and whatever else a motherless child might need. Her father's in Helena, Clara explained, standing in the doorway of the examining room like she couldn't quite make herself leave. Samuel Brennan, he's a mining engineer. Someone needs to send word. I'll wire the sheriff there, Ethan promised. He'll locate Brennan and get him on the next stage. How long will that take? 2 days, maybe 3. Clara's face went carefully blank. I see. You planning to stay until he gets here? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. I promised Emily I'd make sure Sarah was safe. I intend to keep that promise. Of course she did. Ethan found himself almost smiling, though nothing about the situation was remotely funny. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Henley keeps a decent place. I'll walk you over, help you get settled. I don't have any money. Clara said it matter-of-factly, without shame. Everything I had was in my trunk on the coach. I assume the Garretts took it or burned it. Mrs. Henley will extend credit. I'll vouch for you. You don't know me. I know enough. And somehow, impossibly, that was true. Mrs. Henley turned out to be exactly the kind of woman the frontier seemed to produce in abundance. Tough, practical, and possessed of a kindness that showed itself through action rather than words. She took one look at Clara's blood-stained dress and haunted eyes, asked exactly 2 questions. You hurt? And you got a place to go? And then showed her to a small, clean room on the 2nd floor. Bathwater's in the kitchen, Mrs. Henley said. I'll bring it up. You look like you could use a good soak. I don't have money to pay you, Clara said again, and Ethan heard the shame she'd managed to keep out of her voice earlier. Did I ask for money? Mrs. Henley planted her hands on her ample hips. You can work it off once you're rested. I can always use help with the laundry. Now sit down before you fall down, and let me get that bath ready. When she'd bustled out, Clara sank onto the bed like her strings had been cut. For the first time since Ethan had found her, she looked on the verge of breaking. You should rest, he said quietly. I'll send word when Brennan arrives. Marshall. Ethan. Clara looked up at him, and the exhaustion in her face made her look both younger and infinitely older. Those men, the Garretts, will they come back? For you? She nodded. I don't think so. They don't know who you are, where you're from, or what you might have seen, and they're running hard by now, trying to put distance between themselves and the scene. He paused. But I'm going to wire the territorial marshal's office, get more men on their trail. This was their biggest mistake yet, hitting a passenger coach in broad daylight, leaving witnesses. They've crossed a line, and that means they're going to get sloppy. When they do, we'll be ready. When you catch them, Clara's hands twisted together in her lap. When you catch them, what happens then? They'll stand trial, in a proper court, with a proper judge. And if the evidence says they're guilty, and it will, they'll hang. He expected her to flinch, to look away, to show some sign that the violence of frontier justice troubled her. Instead, Clara just nodded slowly. Good, she said. Because men who would kill a mother in front of her child, who would leave a baby to die in the sun, they don't deserve mercy. Ethan studied her face, looking for rage or bloodlust or any of the ugly emotions he'd seen revenge bring out in people. But Clara's expression was calm, almost serene. She wasn't calling for vengeance. She was simply stating a fact about the world and her place in it. I'll leave you to rest, he said, because if he stayed any longer, he was going to start asking questions he had no business asking. If you need anything, I know where to find you. Clara's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. He nodded and left before he could do something stupid, like tell her that protecting her hadn't felt like duty at all. Outside, the night had turned cold the way it always did in the high country. Ethan stood on Mrs. Henley's porch and looked up at the stars, trying to organize his thoughts into something resembling a coherent plan. He needed to send those telegrams, needed to brief the local sheriff, needed to figure out where the Garretts were headed and how to get ahead of them. But his mind kept circling back to a woman with blood on her dress and promises in her eyes, and the way she'd stayed in a place where any sane person would have run. The local sheriff, a weathered man named Tom Garrett, who, despite sharing a name with the outlaws, was honest as the day was long, listened to Ethan's report with the grim attention of someone who'd been expecting bad news and gotten exactly what he'd feared. The Garrett gang's been getting bolder, Tom said, pouring them both coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long. Hit a ranch outside of Billings 2 weeks ago, killed the owner and his 2 sons, burned the house, took everything that wasn't nailed down. We're dealing with rabid dogs, Ethan. They need putting down. I need more men, Ethan said bluntly. I can track them, but if it comes to a fight, and it will, I'm going to need backup I can trust. I'll wire Fort Ellis, see if the Army can spare a detachment, and I've got 2 deputies who know which end of a rifle to point at the bad guys. It's not much, but it's what we've got. What about the woman, Clara Whitfield? You know anything about her? Tom's eyebrows rose. The survivor? Not much. She came through on last week's stage from Omaha, said she was headed to Bozeman to teach school. Kept to herself, paid her fare in cash, no trouble. He paused. Why? You think she's involved somehow? No, I think she's... Ethan stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. I think she's someone who keeps her promises, even when it costs her. And in my experience, that kind of person is rare enough to be worth protecting. Tom studied him with the assessing gaze of a man who'd known Ethan for 5 years, and could read him better than most. You getting attached, Cole? I'm doing my job. Uh-huh. Tom's tone said he didn't believe that for a second, but he was kind enough not to push. Well, your job just got more complicated. Word is, the territorial governor's getting pressure from back east about the lawlessness out here. He's looking to make an example of someone. If you bring in the Garretts, when I bring them in. When you bring them in, Tom corrected with a slight smile, you're going to be a hero. Newspapers, medals, maybe even a promotion. You ready for that? Ethan thought about Clara, about the quiet strength in her voice when she'd said that everyone deserves to know they mattered, about the way she'd cradled a stranger's baby like it was the most important thing in the world. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make sure men like the Garretts can't hurt anyone else, he said. Everything else is just noise. Tom raised his coffee cup in a mock salute. Then let's get to work. The next 2 days passed in a blur of telegrams, depositions, and preparation. Ethan interviewed Clara 3 times, taking down every detail she could remember about the attack, the number of men, their descriptions, the direction they'd ridden, everything. She answered his questions with the same steady composure she'd shown at the coach, never breaking, never wavering. But Ethan was watching for other things now, the way her hands trembled slightly when she talked about hearing Emily Brennan's last breath, the haunted look that crept into her eyes when she thought no one was watching, the way she visited the doctor's house twice a day, checking on Sarah, holding the baby while Martha Patterson prepared bottles and changed diapers and did all the practical things that keeping an infant alive required. She's gotten attached, Martha told Ethan on the second day, her voice low so Clara wouldn't hear. To the baby. It's going to break her heart when the father comes to claim her. Maybe that's a price worth paying, Ethan said, for keeping a promise. Martha looked at him with knowing eyes. Is that what we're talking about? Promises? Ethan didn't answer because he wasn't entirely sure himself. Samuel Brennan arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, haggard and red-eyed from traveling straight through. He was younger than Ethan had expected, maybe 30, with the soft hands of a man who worked with his mind instead of his back. When Martha brought Sarah out, wrapped in clean blankets and sleeping peacefully, Brennan's face crumpled. Emily, he whispered, and it was both a prayer and a curse. Oh, Emily! Clara stood in the corner of the room, her hands folded in front of her, watching. Ethan saw the exact moment her heart broke, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her shoulders drew in as if protecting herself from a blow. Mr. Brennan, she said quietly, I'm Clara Whitfield. I was with your wife when she died. Brennan looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. Was she in pain? Clara moved forward, graceful and certain, and placed her hand on his shoulder. She was at peace, she said, and Ethan knew it was a lie, knew that Emily Brennan had died slowly and in agony, but he also knew it was exactly the lie Samuel Brennan needed to hear. She wanted you to know that she loved you, that she loved Sarah, that she was so proud of the life you were going to build together. It was the right thing to say. Brennan's face twisted, and then he was crying, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Martha ushered them into the sitting room, leaving Ethan and Clara standing in the hallway. You didn't have to do that, Ethan said. Yes, I did. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. He needed to believe she wasn't afraid, that she didn't suffer, and maybe if he believes it hard enough, eventually it'll be true. That's how faith works, isn't it? You believe something until it becomes real. Is that what you do? Believe things until they're real? Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and Ethan felt that same shifting sensation in his chest he'd felt the first time their eyes met. I believe that promises matter, she said. I believe that how we treat each other in the worst moments says more about who we are than anything we do in the good times. And I believe, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, I believe that some people are worth staying for, even when running would be easier. Before Ethan could figure out what to say to that, Martha called them back into the sitting room. Brennan had composed himself, though his eyes were still raw. He held Sarah now, awkward and terrified, like he was afraid he might break her. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I need to thank you for keeping Emily's promise, for making sure Sarah was safe." He swallowed hard. "I don't have much money right now, but once I'm settled again, once I can work—" "I don't want your money, Mr. Brennan." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. "I want you to love that little girl the way her mother loved her. I want you to tell her about Emily, about how brave she was, how strong. And I want you to raise Sarah to be the kind of woman who keeps promises, even when it costs her everything. Can you do that?" Brennan looked down at his daughter, and something shifted in his face. Grief was still there, raw and consuming, but underneath it, Ethan saw the first glimmers of purpose. "I can do that," he said. "I swear it." "Then we have an understanding." Clara reached out and touched Sarah's tiny hand one last time, her fingers lingering for just a moment before she stepped back. "Goodbye, Sarah. Be happy, be loved, be brave." And then she turned and walked out of the room, her spine straight and her head high, and Ethan knew without being told that she was about 10 seconds from falling apart. He found her behind the doctor's house, standing in the small garden Martha kept, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold the pieces together. She wasn't crying, not quite, but her breathing was sharp and shallow, like each inhale cost her something. "You did a good thing," Ethan said, stopping a careful distance away. "I gave away a piece of my heart." Claire's voice was raw. "To a child who will never remember my name. And the worst part is, I'd do it again. I'd make that same promise 1,000 times, even knowing how much this hurts." "Why?" She turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in her face made his chest ache. "Because she needed someone, and I was there. Because sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing. Because—" her voice broke. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without a mother, and if I could spare Sarah even one moment of that loneliness, it was worth it." Ethan closed the distance between them without thinking, without planning, guided by an instinct he didn't fully understand. "You're not alone, Clara." "Aren't I?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have no family, no home, no prospects. I was supposed to be a teacher in Bozeman, but I can't even get there now because I have no money and no way to earn any." She looked down at her hands. "I have nothing except a promise I've already kept and nowhere to go when I leave here." "Then don't leave." The words were out before Ethan could stop them, reckless and true. "Bear Creek needs a teacher. The school's been closed for 2 years because we couldn't find anyone willing to take the job. Stay, teach, build something here." Clara stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "Why would you want me to stay?" "Because when I look at you, I see something I didn't know I was looking for. Because you're the first person I've met in 10 years who made me want to stop moving long enough to see what staying might feel like. Because I found you in a place of death, and you showed me what it looks like when someone refuses to let death have the last word." But Ethan didn't say any of that. Instead, he said, "Because this town could use someone like you, someone who keeps promises, someone who stays." Clara was quiet for a long time, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't name. Finally, she nodded just once, a small movement that felt like a door opening. "All right," she said. "I'll stay. For now. Until I figure out what comes next." It wasn't a promise, not quite, but it was enough. The school building stood at the far end of Main Street, small and weathered, with windows that hadn't seen a cleaning in years and a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Clara stood in front of it 3 days after Samuel Brennan had left with Sarah, her borrowed carpet bag in one hand and a set of keys in the other, wondering what exactly she'd agreed to. "It's not much," Sheriff Tom Garrett said beside her, sounding almost apologetic. "Like Ethan said, we haven't had a teacher in 2 years. The last one married a rancher and moved up to the Judith Basin. Before that, we had a fellow from Boston who lasted exactly 3 weeks before he decided the frontier wasn't for him." "What made him leave?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tom's mouth twitched. "He said the children were uncivilized, also that the town smelled like manure and the water tasted like dirt." He wasn't entirely wrong on either count, but we didn't appreciate his tone. Clara pushed open the door and the smell of dust and mouse droppings hit her like a physical thing. Inside, the single room was chaos. Desks overturned, books scattered, and water damaged. A family of raccoons had clearly been using the corner as a latrine. The blackboard was cracked down the middle, and something had built a nest in what used to be the teacher's desk. "Like I said," Tom offered weakly, "it's not much." "It's perfect," Clara said, and meant it. Because this broken, abandoned, genuinely awful space was something she could fix. Something concrete and manageable, unlike the tangle of grief and confusion that had taken up residence in her chest since she'd watched Sarah disappear down the road in Samuel Brennan's arms. Tom looked at her like she might be suffering from sun fever. "You sure you didn't hit your head in that coach wreck?" "I'm sure." Clara set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. "I'll need cleaning supplies. Lye soap, brushes, buckets. And I'll need to know which children in town are school age and which parents might be convinced to send them. Most folks around here can't afford to lose a child's labor during the day," Tom warned. "Farms and ranches need every hand they can get. You'll be lucky to get half a dozen students, and those will be the ones whose families have enough help to spare them. Then I'll start with half a dozen." Clara was already mentally cataloging what needed to be done first. "Everyone has to start somewhere, Sheriff. Might as well start small and build up." Tom shook his head, but he was smiling. "Ethan said you were stubborn. I'm starting to think he undersold it." At the mention of Ethan's name, Clara felt something flutter in her chest that she absolutely did not have time to examine. "Where's Marshal Cole, anyway? I haven't seen him in 2 days." "Out tracking." Tom's smile faded. "He got word that the Garretts hit another homestead, this one up near the mussel shell. By the time he gets there, investigates, and picks up their trail, he'll be gone at least a week. Maybe 2. "Is it dangerous?" The question came out before Clara could stop it, and she saw Tom's expression shift into something knowing. "Always is, with men like that. But Ethan's good at what he does. Best tracker I've ever seen, and he's got a sense for trouble that's kept him alive longer than most." He paused. "He asked me to keep an eye on you while he was gone. Make sure you're settling in all right." "That was kind of him?" Clara turned away, ostensibly to examine the damaged blackboard, but really to hide whatever her face might be showing. "But unnecessary. I can take care of myself." "Didn't say you couldn't, but Ethan's got a protective streak, especially when it comes to people he thinks deserve protecting." Tom headed for the door. "I'll have Martha send over some supplies. And Miss Whitfield? Welcome to Bear Creek. I think you're going to do just fine here." After he left, Clara stood alone in the wreckage of the schoolroom and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd committed to. She had no money, no family, no safety net of any kind. If this didn't work, if she couldn't make a success of teaching in this small frontier town, she had nowhere else to go and no other options. But she'd made worse bets on worse odds. And at least here, at least now, she had a purpose. She started with the raccoon nest. By the time the sun set that first day, Clara had cleared out the worst of the debris, scrubbed the floors until her hands were raw, and made a list of repairs that would need someone with actual carpentry skills. Her back ached. Her knees were bruised from kneeling on the hard wooden floor, and she was fairly certain she'd never get the smell of raccoon out of her nose. She'd also never felt more satisfied. Martha Patterson found her sitting on the front steps as twilight settled over the town, eating bread and cheese that Mrs. Henley had packed for her. "Heard you've taken on a project," Martha said, lowering herself onto the step with a slight groan. "Tom says you're planning to reopen the school." "Planning to try," Clara corrected. "Whether I succeed is another matter entirely." "Well, you'll have at least one student, my nephew, Jamie. He's 8, smart as a whip, but he can barely read and his arithmetic is worse. His mother, my sister Ruth, she'd send him if she knew there was a real teacher available. Tell her to send him Monday morning, 8 o'clock sharp." Clara took another bite of bread, chewing thoughtfully. "Who else in town has children the right age?" Martha started listing names, and Clara committed them to memory. The blacksmith's 2 daughters, 7 and 9. The general store owner's son, age 10. A rancher's family with 4 children ranging from 6 to 12. A widow with twin boys who were more trouble than they were worth, according to Martha, but who probably just needed someone to pay attention to them. That's nearly a dozen, Clara said when Martha finished. If even half of them show up, that's a good start. You're an optimist, Martha observed. That's either going to serve you well out here or break your heart. My heart's already broken, Clara said lightly. Might as well put the pieces to good use. Martha studied her in the fading light. You're talking about the baby. Sarah. I'm talking about a lot of things. Clara brushed crumbs from her borrowed dress, another cast off from Mrs. Henley's seemingly endless supply of practical clothing. But yes, Sarah, among others. You got someone back east? Someone you left behind? No one who mattered enough to make me stay. Clara looked out at the darkening street, at the handful of lights beginning to glow in windows. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by an aunt who did her duty by me, but never particularly wanted the burden. When I was old enough, I took a teaching position in St. Louis, then another in Omaha. I kept thinking if I moved enough times, I'd find somewhere that felt like home. She laughed quietly. Turns out home isn't a place you find. It's something you build. And you're planning to build it here, in Bear Creek? Clara considered the question seriously. I'm planning to try. I've spent my whole life moving from one temporary situation to another, always waiting for my real life to start. I think I'm tired of waiting. Does this sudden desire for roots have anything to do with a certain tall lawman with good intentions and terrible coffee? I don't know what you mean, Clara said, but she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. Martha laughed, a warm sound that seemed to fill the evening air. Of course you don't, and I'm sure it's pure coincidence that you decided to stay in Bear Creek right after Ethan Cole suggested it. He made a practical argument about the town needing a teacher. And I'm sure that's the only reason you looked like someone kicked you in the chest when Tom mentioned Ethan was out tracking the Garretts. Clara opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Because what was the point? Martha had seen right through her, the way women who'd lived long enough to understand human nature always did. I barely know him, she said instead, which was true but also somehow completely beside the point. Sometimes that doesn't matter. Martha's voice went soft. Sometimes you meet someone and you just know. It's not logical, it's not sensible, but it's real. My Henry, I knew the day I met him. He was a patient, came in with a broken leg from falling off a roof, and I took one look at him and thought, well, there you are. Took you long enough. And did it work out? This instant knowing? We've been married 32 years, so I'd say yes. Martha pushed herself to her feet with another groan. But I'm not saying you should marry Ethan Cole tomorrow. I'm saying that sometimes the heart knows things the head hasn't figured out yet, and sometimes it's worth listening to. After Martha left, Clara sat alone on the steps and thought about promises and hearts, and the strange alchemy that turned strangers into something more. She thought about Ethan's steady presence in the aftermath of horror, the way he'd looked at her like she was someone worth protecting, the way her chest had tightened when Tom mentioned he was tracking dangerous men in dangerous country. She'd told Martha she barely knew him, and that was true. But she also knew the important things. She knew he was the kind of man who vouched for strangers at boarding houses, who sent telegrams and made arrangements for orphaned babies, who'd spent 3 weeks tracking killers because someone needed to stand between civilization and the men who would tear it down. And she knew that when he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. This is foolish, she said out loud to the empty street. You're being foolish. But she stayed on the steps anyway, watching the stars emerge one by one, and wondered if Ethan was looking at the same sky somewhere in the Montana wilderness. The school opened on Monday morning with 7 students, which Clara counted as a victory. Jamie Patterson arrived first, eager and nervous in clothes that had been scrubbed within an inch of their lives. The blacksmith's daughters came next, followed by the rancher's children, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The general store owner's son slouched in last, his expression making it clear that he was only there because his mother had given him no choice. Clara stood at the front of the room, now clean, if still shabby, and looked at the 7 faces watching her with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Whitfield, and I'm very glad you're here." "We don't have a choice," one of the rancher's boys muttered. "Ma said we had to come." "That's true for today," Clara agreed. "But tomorrow, the choice will be yours. I can't make you learn. I can't make you care about reading or arithmetic or history. All I can do is show you what's possible and let you decide if you want it. That got their attention. They were used to adults who demanded obedience, who enforced rules with switches and shame. The idea that they might have agency in their own education was clearly foreign. "What if we decide we don't want it?" the store owner's son challenged. "Then you'll grow up to be exactly what everyone expects you to be," Clara said calmly. "Which might be fine. Plenty of people live perfectly good lives doing what's expected, but some people want more. They want to understand how the world works, want to be able to write letters and keep accounts and read books that take them places they'll never physically go. If you're one of those people, I can help you. If you're not..." She shrugged. "The door's not locked." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Jamie Patterson raised his hand. "I want to learn to read," he said quietly. "Real reading, not just sounding out words. I want to read whole books." "Then that's what we'll work toward." Clara smiled at him. "Anyone else?" Slowly, tentatively, the other hands went up. Even the rancher's boy who'd complained, even the store owner's son who'd challenged her. They were children on the edge of something, caught between the limited world they knew and the vast possibility of everything they didn't yet understand. Clara had been that child once. She knew exactly how it felt. "All right then," she said. "Let's begin." The days developed a rhythm. Clara taught from 8 until 3, breaking only for lunch. After school, she worked on repairs with help from anyone in town who had spare time and basic carpentry skills. Evenings were spent planning lessons and reading by lamplight in her small room at Mrs. Henley's boarding house. It was exhausting. It was lonely. It was the most purposeful Clara had felt in years. The children began to trust her, slowly and then all at once. They brought her their questions, their frustrations, their small triumphs. Jamie Patterson could read full sentences now, his face lighting up with wonder every time the marks on a page resolved into meaning. The blacksmith's younger daughter had a gift for numbers that Clara was carefully nurturing. Even the troublesome rancher's boy, whose name was Tommy, had started staying after school to ask questions about history, about the wider world beyond Montana territory. "Why do you care so much?" he asked her one afternoon in late October, genuine confusion in his voice. "It's not like we're going to amount to anything. We're just ranch kids and blacksmith's daughters. Nobody important." Clara set down the paper she'd been grading and looked at him directly. "Tommy, do you know what I was before I came here?" He shook his head. "I was nobody important either, just an orphan girl who got lucky enough to get an education. And that education, the ability to read, to write, to think clearly, that's what gave me choices. It's what let me decide that when I wanted to start over, I could. You're not just anything. You're a person with a mind and potential, and what you become depends entirely on what you choose to do with that." Tommy ducked his head, but not before she saw the hunger in his eyes, the desperate want to believe that he could be more than what circumstance had handed him. "Now," Clara said briskly, before the moment could get too heavy, "tell me what you remember about the Louisiana Purchase." Ethan returned in early November, 2 weeks after he'd left. Clara heard about it before she saw him. Martha stopped by the school during lunch to mention, with elaborate casualness, that the marshal was back in town and would probably be by to check on how things were going. "After all," Martha said, her eyes twinkling with amusement Clara didn't appreciate, "he did recommend you for this position. He'll want to make sure his judgment was sound." Clara spent the rest of the afternoon pretending she wasn't listening for the sound of boots on the wooden steps, pretending her heart hadn't started beating faster at the knowledge that he was nearby. It was ridiculous. She was a grown woman, not a schoolgirl with a crush. But when Ethan finally appeared in the doorway just as she was dismissing the children for the day, Clara's breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. He looked tired, she noticed. There were new lines around his eyes, and his clothes were trail dusty and worn. But he smiled when he saw her, a slow, genuine expression that made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Miss Whitfield," he said formally, nodding to the children who were staring at him with open curiosity. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Marshal Cole. We were just finishing." Clara turned to her students. "Remember, tomorrow we're starting the multiplication tables. I expect everyone to practice their sums tonight." The collective groan that followed was music to her ears. It meant they cared enough to complain. After the children had scattered, Ethan stepped fully into the room, looking around at the changes she'd made. The repaired desks, the cleaned windows, the new blackboard that the carpenter had installed last week. His expression was hard to read. "You've done well here," he said finally. "Better than well. You've made something out of nothing." "I had help." Clara began gathering papers, needing something to do with her hands. "The whole town pitched in. Tom found me books. Martha donated slates and chalk. Even Mrs. Henley contributed paper and pencils. But you did the work. You showed up every day and made them believe it mattered." Ethan moved closer, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Tom says the children actually want to come to school now. That's not nothing. They're good children. They just needed someone to see them." Clara risked a glance at his face and found him watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "How was your hunt? Did you find the Garretts?" Something dark crossed Ethan's expression. "We found them, or what was left of them." Clara's hand stilled on the papers. "What do you mean?" "They hit the wrong homestead. Turned out the family they tried to rob included 3 brothers, all Army veterans who'd fought in the war. By the time we got there, 2 of the Garretts were dead and the other 3 were in irons." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's over. They'll stand trial in Helena next month, but the outcome's not in doubt. They'll hang." "Good." Clara said it firmly, without hesitation, and watched something shift in Ethan's eyes. "You really mean that?" "I do. Those men killed Emily Brennan. They would have left Sarah to die in the sun. They've destroyed lives, families, futures. Why would I want anything less than justice?" "Most women—" Ethan stopped, shook his head. "Never mind. You're not most women." Is that a compliment or a criticism? It's an observation. He was close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, could smell leather and horse, and the particular scent of the high country that clung to men who spent their lives outdoors. "Clara, I need to ask you something." Her heart kicked against her ribs. "All right. Did you stay in Bear Creek because you wanted to teach, or did you stay because I asked you to?" It was a fair question, and Clara had asked herself the same thing at least 100 times in the past month. The honest answer was complicated, layered, impossible to reduce to a simple yes or no. "Both," she said finally. "I stayed because the opportunity was real and I needed work. But I also stayed because—" She took a breath, gathered her courage. "Because when you asked me to stay, it was the first time in a very long time that someone saw me as something other than temporary. You looked at me like I was someone worth keeping around, and I wanted to know what that might feel like if I let myself believe it." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. "And? How does it feel?" "Terrifying," Clara admitted, "because I'm starting to care about this place, about these children, about—" She couldn't quite make herself finish that sentence, couldn't quite name the thing that pulled tight in her chest every time she saw him. "About what?" Ethan's voice had gone rough. "About whether you came back safe," Clara said quietly. "When Tom told me you were hunting the Garretts, that it might be dangerous, I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways it could go wrong. I've known you less than 2 months, and somehow the idea of you not coming back felt unbearable. That shouldn't be possible. It doesn't make sense." "No," Ethan agreed. "It doesn't, but that doesn't make it less real." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, warm and calloused and gentle. "I thought about you out there," he said, "when I was tracking them, when we finally caught up with them. I kept thinking about how you stayed with a dying woman and kept a promise to a stranger. How you saw a broken-down school and decided to fix it. How you look at difficult things and don't flinch." His hand dropped back to his side. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, Clara Whitfield, and I don't know what to do with that except tell you the truth." "What truth?" "That I want to know you, really know you. Not as the marshal who helped you when you needed it, but as—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "As someone who sees you the way you deserve to be seen. As someone who wants to build something with you, if you're willing." Clara's throat had gone tight. "Build what?" "I don't know yet." Ethan's smile was crooked, uncertain in a way she'd never seen from him before. "But I'd like to find out." if you're interested. She should say no, should point out all the very sensible reasons why this was a terrible idea. She'd barely been in town 2 months. She was still grieving the loss of Sarah. She had her teaching position to think about and a reputation to maintain. Getting involved with the local lawman would complicate everything. But when Clara opened her mouth, what came out was, "I'm interested." The smile that broke across Ethan's face was worth every bit of risk, every bit of uncertainty. Yeah? Yeah. And then, because she was already falling and might as well fall all the way, "Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Mrs. Henley sets a decent table, and I think we should probably have an actual conversation that doesn't involve dead bodies or traumatized children." Ethan laughed, a surprised, genuine sound that made something in Clara's chest expand. "I would like that very much." "Good." Clara felt suddenly shy, like a girl instead of a woman of 32. Then it settled. "It's settled," Ethan agreed. He tipped his hat to her, formal and slightly ridiculous given what they'd just said to each other. "I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Whitfield." "Tomorrow, Marshal Cole." After he left, Clara sank into her chair and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. What had she just done? What was she thinking? Inviting a man to dinner, admitting that she'd worried about him, agreeing to try to build something she couldn't even name. But underneath the panic was something else, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The next evening, Clara changed clothes 3 times before settling on the same simple blue dress she'd worn to teach that day. It was foolish to make a fuss, she told herself. This was just dinner, just 2 people sharing a meal. But when Ethan arrived at Mrs. Henley's precisely at 6, wearing clean clothes and looking nervous in a way that made him somehow more attractive, Clara knew they were both lying to themselves about what this was. Mrs. Henley seated them in the small dining room, served them beef stew and fresh bread, and then disappeared with a knowing smile that made Clara want to sink through the floor. "She's not subtle," Ethan observed, amusement coloring his voice. "No one in this town is subtle." Clara broke off a piece of bread, grateful to have something to do with her hands. "I think the entire population has been speculating about us since the day you brought me here." "Does that bother you?" "It should." Clara considered the question honestly. "But no, I spent too many years trying to be invisible, trying not to make waves or draw attention. It's almost refreshing to have people pay attention because they care, not because they're looking for something to criticize." "Tell me about that," Ethan said. "About before. You said you had an aunt who raised you?" And so Clara told him. About growing up in St. Louis with a woman who did her duty but never showed warmth. About teaching positions in schools where she was always the outsider, always temporary. About the loneliness of moving from place to place, never quite belonging anywhere. "I kept thinking I was looking for the right place," she said, "but I think what I was really looking for was a reason to stay. Does that make sense?" Perfect sense. Ethan had been listening with the same focused attention he'd given her testimony about the coach attack, like every word mattered. "I know something about running. You seem so rooted, so certain of your purpose." "Now maybe, but I wasn't always." Ethan looked down at his bowl, his expression distant. "I grew up in Ohio. My father was a farmer, wanted me to take over the family land, but I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "After the war, I couldn't settle. Couldn't stand being in one place, doing the same things day after day. So I headed west and kept heading west until I found work that felt like it mattered. Chasing bad men. Protecting good people," Ethan corrected gently. "There's a difference. One is about revenge. The other is about making sure there's something worth protecting." He looked up, met her eyes. "I thought that was enough. The work, the purpose, the constant moving. And then I met a woman who stayed in a killing field because she'd made a promise, and suddenly what used to feel like enough started feeling hollow." Clara's breath caught. "Ethan, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm just telling you the truth. That's what we're doing here, right? Being honest?" "Right." Clara swallowed hard. "Then I should tell you that I'm terrified. Of this, of you, of how much I already care after such a short time. I've spent my whole life being careful, being safe, not taking risks that might leave me hurt. And everything about you feels like a risk." "Is it worth it?" Ethan's voice was quiet, intense. "The risk?" Clara thought about the past 2 months, the broken school she'd rebuilt, the children who looked at her with trust and hope, the way this small, dusty frontier town had started to feel less like exile and more like home. And yes, the way her heart lifted every time she saw a tall figure in a lawman's coat walking down Main Street. "I think it might be," she said. "I think you might be." Ethan reached across the table, his hand palm up in invitation. Clara looked at it for a long moment, at the calluses and scars, at the strength and steadiness, and then she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and Clara felt something shift and settle in her chest, like a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing had finally found its way home. They talked long after they'd finished eating, about everything and nothing, about books they'd read and places they'd seen and dreams they'd had as children, about the difference between loneliness and solitude, between running away and moving forward, about what it meant to choose a life instead of just letting life happen to you. "I want to do this right," Ethan said as the evening wound down. "Court you properly, take you to church socials and town dances. Let people see that my intentions are honorable." "Are they?" Clara asked, only half teasing. "Honorable." "Completely." Ethan's expression was serious. "I'm not interested in something temporary, Clara. I'm too old and too tired for games. If we're doing this, I want to do it with the intention of building something that lasts." That's a lot of pressure for a second conversation. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, we've been having the same conversation since the day I found you. We've just been taking our time getting around to saying it out loud. He was right, Clara realized. This thing between them, this pull, this recognition, it had been there from the beginning. They just needed time to trust it, to trust themselves. "All right," she said. "Let's build something that lasts. Let's see what happens when two people who've spent their lives running finally decide to stay." Ethan's smile was like sunrise, warm and full of promise. "I'd like that very much." He walked her to her room afterward, proper and respectful, but at her door he paused. "Thank you," he said, "for taking a chance on this. On me." "Thank you for asking me to stay," Clara replied, "for seeing something in me worth keeping around." "Always," Ethan said, and it sounded like a vow. After he left, Clara sat by her window and looked out at the Montana night. Somewhere out there, Sarah was growing up safe and loved. The Garrett gang was behind bars awaiting justice. And here, in this small town at the edge of everything, Clara Whitfield had found something she'd stopped believing existed. She'd found a place worth staying for, and more terrifying, more wonderful, she'd found a person worth staying with. It was too soon to call it love, too soon to make promises about forever. But it was enough to make her believe that forever might be possible, and for now, that was more than enough. Winter came to Bear Creek with a vengeance that year, bringing snow that piled 3 feet deep against the schoolhouse walls and temperatures that made Clara's bones ache. But the children still came, bundled in layers of wool and fur, their cheeks red from the cold and their eyes bright with the hunger to learn. Clara kept the pot-bellied stove burning hot and taught them mathematics while they huddled close for warmth, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. Ethan came by most evenings after his rounds, checking on the stove, bringing extra firewood, staying for coffee that they drank while sitting on opposite sides of her small room at Mrs. Henley's, propriety maintained even as something deeper grew between them. They talked about everything, his cases, her students, books they'd read, places they'd seen, and slowly, carefully, they began talking about futures that included each other. "The territorial judge is coming through in February," Ethan mentioned one night in mid-December, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "He'll be hearing the Garrett case in Helena. I'll need to testify, and so will you." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'll have to see them? Face them?" "You'll have to be in the same courtroom. But Clara, they'll be in shackles, surrounded by armed guards. They can't hurt you." Ethan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'll be right there with you. I won't let anything happen to you." "I know." And she did know, intellectually. But the thought of being in the same room as the men who'd killed Emily Brennan, who'd left Sarah orphaned, who'd shattered so many lives, it made her hands shake. Ethan noticed, because he noticed everything about her. He set down his cup and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "You don't have to do this if you can't," he said quietly. Your testimony would help, but we have enough evidence without it. The homesteaders who captured them, the physical evidence, the other crimes they've committed. If testifying is too much—" "No." Clara cut him off, her voice firmer than she felt. "I need to do this. For Emily. For Sarah. For everyone they've hurt. I need to stand up and tell the truth about what they did." "Then I'll be right beside you," Ethan promised, every step of the way. He was still holding her hands, and Clara found herself studying the way his fingers intertwined with hers, rough and warm and solid. Without thinking, she lifted one of his hands to her cheek, pressing it there like she could draw strength from his touch. "Stay," she whispered, "just for a little while longer." Ethan stayed until the fire in the stove burned low, and Mrs. Henley's pointed cough from the hallway reminded them that propriety had limits. When he finally left, Clara lay awake in the darkness and tried not to think about standing in a courtroom and reliving the worst day of her life. The weeks before Christmas passed in a blur of lesson plans and evening visits, of children's recitations and stolen moments with Ethan that felt both entirely innocent and charged with possibility. The town was preparing for a Christmas social, and Clara found herself swept up in the preparations despite her initial reluctance. "You're part of this community now," Martha told her firmly while they cut paper decorations in the church basement. "That means you participate in the celebrations, like it or not." "I like it," Clara protested. I'm just not used to being included." "Well, get used to it." Martha tied off a string of paper chains with efficient movements. "And speaking of being included, I hear Ethan Cole asked you to save him a dance at the social." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. News travels fast. In a town this size, news travels at the speed of light. Martha's eyes twinkled. "So are you going to dance with him, or are you going to keep pretending you're not head over heels for the man?" We're not, it's complicated." "Love usually is." Martha set down her scissors and looked at Clara seriously. "But sweetheart, sometimes the complicated things are worth the effort. And I've seen the way you two look at each other when you think nobody's watching. That's not complicated. That's as simple and true as it gets." The Christmas social arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. The church hall had been decorated with pine boughs and candles, and someone had brought in a fiddle player from the next town over. The whole community turned out, farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, all dressed in their Sunday best and ready to celebrate making it through another year. Clara wore a dress that Mrs. Henley had altered for her, deep green wool that brought out the color in her eyes. She'd pinned her hair up carefully, leaving a few curls loose around her face, and when Ethan saw her standing by the punch table, the expression on his face made every minute of preparation worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "May I have this dance?" "You may," Clara said, and let him lead her onto the floor. She'd expected awkwardness. She wasn't a particularly skilled dancer, and she'd never danced with Ethan before. But he moved with surprising grace, guiding her through the steps with gentle pressure at her waist, his hand warm and steady in hers. "Where did a frontier lawman learn to dance like this?" Clara asked, breathless from more than just the movement. "My mother insisted," Ethan said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She said that a gentleman should be able to dance, regardless of what profession he chose. I fought her on it, but now—" His hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Now I'm grateful." They turned in time to the music, and Clara caught sight of her students watching from the sidelines. Jamie Patterson gave her an enthusiastic wave, and the blacksmith's daughters were whispering behind their hands, giggling at the sight of their teacher dancing with the marshal. "We're being watched," Clara murmured. "Let them watch." Ethan pulled her marginally closer, still respectable, but intimate enough that Clara could feel the warmth of him through her dress. "I'm courting you, Clara Whitfield. Everyone in this town knows it, and I'm not ashamed of it." "Courting," Clara repeated, testing the weight of the word. "That's very formal." "I'm a formal kind of man when it matters." The music slowed, and Ethan slowed with it, his movements becoming almost languid. "And you matter, Clara, more than I knew how to say at first, more than I know how to say now." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. Before we go to Helena, before the trial, before anything else happens. I needed you to know that what I feel for you is real. It's not gratitude for what you did for Sarah, or admiration for how you've built this school, or even just attraction, though it's all of those things. He paused, searching for words. It's the feeling that I've been walking around my whole life with a piece of myself missing, and then I found you kneeling in the dirt holding a stranger's baby, and that piece clicked into place. The music ended, and couples around them began to separate, moving toward refreshments or conversations. But Claire and Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the floor, looking at each other while the rest of the world faded into background noise. "I'm falling in love with you," Clara said, the words coming out in a rush before she could second-guess them. "I've been trying not to, trying to be sensible and practical and all the things I've always been, but I can't help it. When I'm with you, I feel like the person I was always supposed to be. Braver, stronger, more certain." Ethan's face transformed, joy breaking through his usual careful control. "Clara, Mum, but I'm also terrified," she continued, needing to get it all out. "Because I've never felt this way before. I've never let myself be this vulnerable. And if something happens to you out there, when you're tracking criminals or breaking up fights or doing any of the 100 dangerous things your job requires, nothing's going to happen to me," Ethan said firmly. "I'm careful, Clara. I've been doing this work for 10 years, and I'm still here because I'm cautious and smart, and I don't take unnecessary risks. But you can't promise that. Nobody can promise that." "You're right. I can't." Ethan's honesty was both painful and reassuring. "But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to come back to you. And I can promise that however long we get, whether it's 50 years or 5, I'll make every day count." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "That's not fair. You can't say things like that and expect me to maintain my composure." "Then don't maintain it." Ethan smiled, tender and understanding. "We're allowed to feel things, Clara. That's what makes us human." Someone called for another dance, and the fiddle struck up a livelier tune. Ethan led Clara off the floor, his hand at the small of her back, possessive and gentle. They spent the rest of the evening in each other's orbit, dancing when the music moved them, talking with neighbors, watching the children run wild on sugar and excitement. It was, Clara thought, the best Christmas she could remember having, not because of presents or decorations, but because she was surrounded by people who cared about her, in a place she was beginning to think of as home, with a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. The trial was set for the first week of February, which gave Clara exactly 6 weeks to prepare herself for the ordeal. Ethan helped where he could, walking her through what to expect, explaining courtroom procedures, assuring her that the judge, a man named Winston Cartwright, who had a reputation for fairness, would not allow the defendants to intimidate witnesses. "They'll have lawyers," Ethan explained one evening while they reviewed her testimony. "Court-appointed, probably not very good, but they'll try to discredit your account. They might suggest you were too traumatized to remember clearly, or that you had a reason to lie." "Why would I lie about witnessing a massacre?" Clara asked, incredulous. "They'll claim you're trying to make a name for yourself, or that you have something against them personally. It doesn't have to make sense. It just has to create reasonable doubt in the jury's minds." Clara absorbed this, her jaw tightening. "Then I'll make sure my testimony is so clear, so detailed, that there can't be any doubt." And so she spent hours going over every moment of that terrible day, writing down times and descriptions and exact quotes where she could remember them. It was brutal work, forcing herself to relive the sounds of gunfire and Emily's labored breathing and Sarah's desperate cries. Some nights she woke gasping from nightmares, her sheets soaked with sweat, the smell of blood and dust so vivid she could taste it. On those nights she would light a lamp and read until dawn, anything to keep the memories at bay. And in the morning, Ethan would appear at her door with coffee and steady presence, never asking if she was all right because they both knew she wasn't, just being there until the world felt solid again. January brought a thaw, the snow melting into mud that made the streets nearly impassable. School continued despite the mess, and Clara found herself grateful for the distraction. Her students were progressing beautifully. Jamie could read at a level far beyond his years. The blacksmith's daughters had memorized their multiplication tables up to 12, and even Tommy had stopped complaining about having to attend. "Miss Whitfield," Tommy said one afternoon after the other children had left, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." Clara looked up from the papers she was grading. When you were on that stagecoach, when those men came, were you scared? It was such a direct question, so unlike Tommy's usual reluctance to engage with anything emotional. Clara set down her pen and gave him her full attention. I was terrified, she said honestly. I thought I was going to die. But you didn't run. Aunt Martha said you stayed even after they left, even though you could have gotten away. I stayed because I made a promise. Sometimes keeping promises costs us something. Tommy chewed on this for a moment. My pa says promises don't matter much in the real world. He says what matters is being smart enough not to get caught doing wrong. Clara's heart sank. She knew Tommy's father had a reputation for cutting corners and bending rules. What do you think, Tommy? Do you believe promises don't matter? The boy was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, I think they matter to you, and you're the smartest person I know, so maybe my pa's wrong. Your father loves you, Clara said carefully. But parents aren't always right about everything. You get to decide for yourself what kind of person you want to be, whether promises matter, whether honesty matters. Those are choices only you can make. And if I choose different than my pa, if I want to be different than him, then you'll be brave, Clara said firmly. The bravest kind of person, someone who chooses their own path instead of just following the one laid out for them. Tommy nodded slowly, something settling in his young face. Thanks, Miss Whitfield. After he left, Clara sat alone in the quiet schoolroom and thought about choices and consequences and the weight of being a person that children looked up to. It was a responsibility she'd never fully appreciated before, this shaping of young minds and hearts. But it was also a privilege, being trusted with their questions and fears and hopes. The stage to Helena left at dawn on the first Monday in February. Clara stood on the platform with her single bag, watching the sun rise over the mountains and trying to calm the churning in her stomach. Ethan was beside her, solid and reassuring, his hand at her elbow. You don't have to do this, he said one more time, giving her a final chance to back out. Yes, I do. Clara turned to face him, and something in her expression must have convinced him, because he nodded and didn't argue further. The journey took 2 days, stopping overnight in a way station that was marginally cleaner than a barn. Ethan had arranged for separate rooms, maintaining propriety even though Clara would have given almost anything to not be alone with her thoughts. But she understood why he was being careful. Her reputation mattered, especially as the town's schoolteacher, and any hint of impropriety could undermine everything she'd built. Helena was bigger than Bear Creek, a real city with paved streets and gas lights and buildings that rose 3 stories high. The courthouse was an imposing structure of stone and iron, and just looking at it made Clara's palms sweat. Remember, Ethan said as they climbed the steps, you're just telling the truth. That's all anyone is asking of you. The courtroom was packed with people, reporters from Eastern newspapers, curious locals, family members of other victims. Clara took her seat in the witness section and tried not to look at the defendant's table, but her eyes were drawn there despite her best efforts. The 3 surviving Garrett gang members sat in shackles, their faces hard and unrepentant. The oldest was maybe 40, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The other 2 were younger, brothers if the resemblance meant anything, with the kind of cold eyes that came from years of not caring who they hurt. When they brought in the jury, 12 men in work clothes and Sunday suits, farmers and merchants, and ordinary citizens, Clara felt the full weight of what was happening. These men would decide whether the Garretts lived or died, and her testimony would be part of that decision. The prosecutor was a sharp-faced man named Aldrich who explained the case with clinical precision. The murders, the robberies, the pattern of violence that stretched across 3 territories. Then he called his first witness, one of the Homesteader brothers who'd captured the gang. Clara listened as the man described the attack on his family, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was recounting. Then came the territorial marshal who'd investigated the scenes, presenting evidence with professional detachment. Then a doctor who'd examined the bodies from the stagecoach attack, his medical testimony confirming what everyone already knew, that Emily Brennan and the others had been shot at close range, executed rather than killed in any kind of fair fight. And then they called Clara's name. Her legs felt like water as she walked to the witness stand. The judge, an elderly man with kind eyes and an impressive beard, swore her in, and she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Aldrich approached with a gentle smile, designed to put her at ease. "Miss Whitfield, can you tell the court where you were on October 15th of last year?" Clara took a breath and began. She told them about boarding the stage in Omaha, about the journey west, about Emily Brennan and her baby daughter. She described the attack in careful detail, the sound of gunfire, the shouting, the chaos. She told them about hiding, about the terrible minutes after the gang left when she'd listened to Emily's breathing get slower and more labored. "And what did Mrs. Brennan ask you to do?" Aldrich prompted. "She asked me to take care of Sarah, to make sure her daughter got to her father safely." Clara's voice wavered slightly. "She made me promise." "And did you keep that promise, Miss Whitfield?" "Yes. I stayed with Sarah until Marshal Cole found us, and then I stayed in Bear Creek until her father could come claim her." Aldrich smiled. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield. Your witness." The defense attorney was a thin man with nervous hands who approached the stand like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Whitfield, you said you were hiding during the attack?" "Yes." "So you didn't actually see who fired the shots that killed Mrs. Brennan?" "No, but I heard it." "Yes or no, please. Did you see the defendants fire those shots?" Clara's jaw tightened. "No, I did not see them fire the shots. And yet you're willing to testify that these men are responsible." "I heard them. I heard them laughing about how the woman on the coach wouldn't be needing her wedding ring anymore. I heard them talking about the strongbox they'd taken and the mail they'd burned. I came out of hiding and saw 3 dead bodies and a dying woman. And the tracks led north, the same direction Marshal Cole was tracking the Garrett gang." The attorney's mouth thinned. "But you can't say with absolute certainty that my clients were the ones who—" "Counselor," Judge Cartwright interrupted mildly, "Miss Whitfield has answered your question. Move on or sit down." The attorney tried a few more approaches, suggesting Clara was mistaken about the timeline, implying she might have been too traumatized to remember clearly. But Clara held firm, answering each question with calm precision, and eventually he gave up. When she was finally dismissed, Clara walked back to her seat on shaking legs. Ethan caught her eye from across the room, and the pride and support in his expression steadied her. The trial lasted 3 more days. They heard from more witnesses, more experts, more people whose lives had been destroyed by the Garrett gang's violence. And through it all, the defendants sat impassive and uncaring, showing no remorse for the lives they'd taken. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge set sentencing for the following morning, and that night Ethan took Clara to a small restaurant where they could sit in relative privacy and try to process what had happened. "You were remarkable," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "The way you held your ground when that lawyer tried to rattle you, Clara, you were perfect." "I just told the truth." But she felt the weight of it, the knowledge that her testimony had helped condemn 3 men to death. "Ethan, do you ever wonder if we have the right to decide who lives and who dies?" "Every day," he said quietly. "But then I think about Emily Brennan dying in the dirt, about Sarah growing up without a mother, about all the other people the Garretts hurt, all the lives they destroyed, and I remember that justice isn't about revenge. It's about protecting the innocent by removing those who prey on them. Is that enough? Is that justification enough?" "It has to be." Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "Because if we don't stand up to men like that, if we don't say that there are consequences for violence and cruelty, then what's the point of civilization? What's the point of laws and courts and trying to build something better?" Clara thought about her students, about the future she was helping them build through education and opportunity, about the choice Tommy was making to be different from his father, about all the small, quiet acts of courage that added up to progress. "You're right," she said finally. "It has to be enough, because the alternative is chaos." The sentencing hearing the next morning was brief and brutal. Judge Cartwright showed no mercy, condemning all 3 defendants to hang for their crimes. The date was set for March 1st, giving them less than a month to make peace with whatever they believed in. As the marshals led the prisoners away in chains, the oldest one, the one with the scar, turned and looked directly at Clara. His eyes were cold and dead, and for one terrible moment she thought he was going to say something. But then Ethan was there, stepping between them, his body a wall of protection. "Don't look at her," Ethan said, his voice flat and dangerous. Don't even think about her. The marshal handling the prisoner jerked him forward, and the moment broke. But Clara felt cold all the way through, chilled by the hatred in that brief glance. "He can't hurt you," Ethan said as they left the courthouse. "He's going to hang, Clara. He can't hurt anyone ever again." "I know." But she still felt the weight of that stare, the promise of violence in those dead eyes. They took the stage back to Bear Creek the next morning, and Clara spent the journey trying to shake off the darkness that had settled over her. Ethan was quiet beside her, clearly giving her space to process, but his presence was a comfort even in silence. When they finally rolled into Bear Creek 2 days later, Clara felt something in her chest ease. The town looked the same as when they'd left, small, dusty, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know better. But to Clara, it looked like home. Mrs. Henley met them at the boarding house with hot coffee and fresh bread. Martha stopped by with news of all the town gossip Clara had missed. And the next morning, her students arrived at school with drawings they'd made and stories they wanted to share, their faces bright with the simple joy of having their teacher back. "Did you see the bad men?" Jamie asked during lunch break, his eyes wide. "I did," Clara confirmed. "I had to tell the judge what happened to make sure justice was served." "Were you scared?" Clara thought about lying, about presenting a brave face, but these children deserved honesty. "Yes," she said, "I was very scared, but Marshal Cole was there with me, and I knew that telling the truth was more important than being comfortable." "That's what you always say," Tommy observed from where he was sitting on the steps. "That doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing." "And do you believe it?" Clara asked. Tommy was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I do." That evening, Ethan came by after his rounds, and Clara made tea while he built up the fire in her small stove. They sat together in companionable silence, not needing words to communicate the relief of being home, of being safe, of having survived something difficult together. "Clara," Ethan said finally, setting down his cup, "I've been thinking." "About?" "About us. About the future." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I know it's only been a few months. I know we're still learning each other, still figuring out what this is. But I also know that I don't want to waste time pretending I'm not certain." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "Certain about what?" "About you. About wanting to build a life with you." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I'm not asking for anything right now. I know you need time. Know we both need time. But I wanted you to know where my heart is, where it's been since the day I found you protecting a stranger's child like your life depended on it." "Ethan," Clara's voice caught on his name. "You don't have to say anything back," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know. After the trial, after facing those men and being reminded how fragile life is, I needed you to know that what I feel for you isn't temporary. It's not going to fade. This is real, Clara, the realest thing I've ever felt." Clara looked at him, at this good, steady man who'd walked into her life at its darkest moment and somehow made her believe in light again. "I love you," she said, the words simple and true. "I think I've loved you since you vouched for me at Mrs. Henley's, since you believed I was worth protecting before you knew anything about me except that I kept promises." Ethan's face transformed with joy. "Clara, but I'm still scared," she continued, needing him to understand. "I'm scared of how much I need you, scared of building my life around someone who might not come home one day. I'm scared of being that vulnerable again." "I know." Ethan pulled her close, and Clara let herself lean into his strength. "But here's what I think. Being scared means you're alive. It means you're risking something that matters. And I'd rather risk everything with you than play it safe with anyone else." They sat together as darkness fell outside, holding each other while the fire crackled and the wind howled against the windows. And Clara thought about fear and courage, about the difference between running from life and running toward it. She'd spent so many years playing it safe, keeping her heart carefully guarded, never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. And where had that gotten her? Alone and lonely, moving from place to place without ever belonging anywhere. But here, with Ethan, she was choosing something different. She was choosing to stay, to risk, to build something that mattered even knowing it might break her heart. It was terrifying. It was the bravest thing she'd ever done, and she wouldn't trade it for all the safety in the world. Spring came late that year, the ground staying frozen well into March, but when it finally arrived, it brought wildflowers that carpeted the hills in purple and gold. Clara took her students outside for lessons when the weather allowed, teaching them botany by letting them collect specimens, teaching them writing by having them describe what they saw. The children bloomed along with the landscape, their confidence growing as their knowledge deepened. On the morning of March 1st, Clara woke before dawn and lay in bed watching the sky lighten outside her window. Today the Garrett gang would hang in Helena. Today the men who'd killed Emily Brennan would face the consequences of their choices. She should have felt satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead, she felt only a bone-deep weariness, like some part of her had been holding tension for months and could finally let go. Ethan found her at the schoolhouse during lunch, standing at the window and watching her students play in the muddy yard. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her and let his presence speak for itself. "It's done," he said finally. "I got the telegram an hour ago. All three, no complications." Clara nodded, still looking out at the children. Jamie was showing the younger kids how to skip rocks in a puddle. Tommy was helping one of the blacksmith's daughters climb a tree, patient and careful in a way he never would have been 6 months ago. "Do you feel different?" Ethan asked. "Now that it's over?" "I don't know what I feel," Clara admitted. "Relief, maybe, but also just tired. Like I've been carrying something heavy and I finally got to put it down, but the weight of it left marks that won't fade anytime soon." "That's normal." Ethan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of practice. "Justice doesn't erase what happened. It just draws a line under it, says this is finished, now we move forward." "And do we? Move forward?" "We do." Ethan turned her to face him, his expression gentle but certain. "We honor what was lost by building something worth having. We remember Emily Brennan by making sure Sarah grows up in a world that's a little bit safer, a little bit better. We move forward because that's what living people do." Clara leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest and breathing in the familiar scent of leather and soap and high country air. "When did you get so wise?" "About the same time I met a woman who taught me that keeping promises matters more than staying safe." She could hear the smile in his voice. "You've changed me, Clara Whitfield. Made me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need." "What kinds of things?" "A home, a future, someone to come back to at the end of the day." Ethan's arms came around her, solid and warm. "A wife, if she'll have me." Clara's breath caught. She pulled back far enough to see his face, to read the truth in his eyes. "Ethan, I'm not asking yet," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. Know you need time to breathe after everything that's happened. But I wanted you to know where my heart is heading. Wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be waiting." The bell for afternoon lessons rang, and children started trickling back toward the schoolhouse. Clara knew she should step away, should maintain the professional distance that propriety demanded. But instead she rose on her toes and pressed a quick, fierce kiss to Ethan's mouth. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, then slipped past him before he could respond, her heart racing and her face warm. She could feel him watching her as she gathered her students, could sense his smile even without looking back. And for the first time since that terrible day on the Montana plains, Clara felt something very much like joy. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Clara taught, Ethan kept the peace, and in the evenings they found ways to be together that satisfied both their growing need for each other and the town's expectations of decorum. They took walks along the creek for which the town was named. They attended church socials and town meetings. They sat on Mrs. Henley's porch and talked while the landlady chaperoned from a careful distance, her knitting needles clicking with knowing amusement. But Clara could feel the question hovering between them, unasked but present. When would she be ready? When would she trust that this thing between them was solid enough to build a life on? The answer came from an unexpected source. In mid-April, a letter arrived addressed to Clara in careful, educated handwriting. She opened it over breakfast at Mrs. Henley's, expecting perhaps word from the school board in Bozeman or a response to one of her supply orders. Instead, she found a letter from Samuel Brennan, The words were simple but devastating in their sincerity. He wrote about Sarah, who was thriving despite the loss of her mother, about his grief, which remained sharp but was learning to coexist with joy in his daughter's laughter. And he wrote about Clara, thanking her for keeping Emily's promise, for staying when running would have been easier, for making sure Sarah knew she was loved, even in her mother's final moments. But it was the final paragraph that made Clara's hands shake. Emily spoke of you in those last hours, Brennan wrote. She said you had kind eyes and a steady voice, and she knew Sarah would be safe with you. She also said something else, something I didn't understand at the time, but which has come to mean everything to me. She said, "That woman knows how to stay. She won't run when things get hard." Miss Whitfield, Emily's final gift to me, beyond our daughter, was showing me what strength looks like. She stayed conscious through unbearable pain to make sure Sarah would be protected. And you stayed in a place of death to honor a dying woman's request. You both taught me that love isn't just about the good times. It's about staying through the hard times, about keeping promises even when they cost you everything. I'm writing to thank you for that lesson. It's helping me be the father Sarah deserves. Clara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, before she finally understood what it was telling her. Emily Brennan hadn't just asked her to protect Sarah. She'd shown Clara what it meant to love someone completely, without reservation, even unto death. And Clara had been so busy being afraid of loss that she'd almost missed the point entirely. Love wasn't about protecting yourself from pain. It was about choosing someone despite the pain, because what you built together was worth the risk. She found Ethan at the sheriff's office, going over reports with Tom Garrett. The moment he saw her face, he stood up. "Clara, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She was still holding the letter, still crying, and she probably looked like a disaster. "Everything's right. Or it will be if you meant what you said." Ethan's expression shifted from concern to something that looked almost like hope. "What did I say?" "About wanting a wife. About waiting until I was ready." Clara took a shaky breath. "I'm ready, Ethan. I'm ready to stop being afraid and start building something real." Tom Garrett cleared his throat loudly. "I'm going to step outside for a few minutes, check on the horses. Maybe take an hour or 2 doing it." He left, closing the door with exaggerated care, and then it was just Clara and Ethan in the small office, looking at each other across a space that felt charged with possibility. "You're sure?" Ethan asked, his voice rough. "Because Clara, if we do this, if you say yes, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. And I need to know you're certain. I'm certain that life is fragile and brief, and wasting it being afraid is the worst thing I could do." Clara moved closer, drawn by the gravity of him. "I'm certain that you're the best man I've ever known. I'm certain that when I think about my future, you're in every version of it I can imagine." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see the gold flecks in his eyes. "And I'm certain that if you ask me properly, my answer will be yes." Ethan's smile was slow and devastating. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, worn at the edges like he'd been carrying it for a while. "I bought this in Helena," he said, "after the trial. I was going to wait months, maybe a year, give you all the time you needed, but I wanted to have it ready for when you were." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing flashy but beautiful in its straightforward elegance. "Clara Whitfield, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life keeping the promises I make to you?" "Yes." The word came out fierce and certain, all her doubt burned away by the clarity of what she felt. "Yes, Ethan Cole, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her hand. Then he was pulling her close, and she was rising to meet him, and their kiss was everything a first kiss should be. Promise and passion and the sweet relief of finally letting yourself fall. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Clara pressed her hand to Ethan's chest and felt his heart racing beneath her palm. "When?" she asked. "When should we do this?" "Tomorrow wouldn't be too soon for me," Ethan admitted. "But I suppose we should give the town time to prepare." "A month?" "2 weeks," Clara countered. "I don't want a big wedding, Ethan. I just want you and me and the people who matter, making promises we intend to keep." 2 weeks, then." He kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. I love you, Clara. I've loved you since I found you in that killing field, refusing to abandon a child who needed you. And I'm going to love you for the rest of my life. I'm going to hold you to that, Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. News of their engagement spread through Bear Creek faster than wildfire. By evening, the entire town knew, and Clara found herself bombarded with congratulations and offers of help. Martha insisted on making the wedding cake. Mrs. Henley declared she would host the reception at the boarding house. Even Tom Garrett, normally gruff and taciturn, pulled Clara aside to tell her she was getting a good man, and he'd better never hear of Ethan treating her poorly, or there would be hell to pay. Her students were beside themselves with excitement. The girls immediately began planning what they would wear, and Jamie asked if he could stand up with Ethan during the ceremony. "You've been like a son to him," Martha explained when she brought Jamie by to make the request official. "Ever since Ethan started helping with your reading lessons, Jamie's looked up to him something fierce." Clara looked at the boy's hopeful face and felt her heart expand. "I think that would be perfect, Jamie. Every groom should have someone he trusts standing beside him." The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Clara sewed a new dress with help from the blacksmith's wife, who turned out to have a gift for tailoring. Simple cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Nothing fancy but beautiful in its understated elegance. Ethan arranged for the territorial judge, the same one who'd presided over the Garrett trial, to come perform the ceremony, wanting everything legal and binding. And through it all, Clara felt a sense of rightness that grew stronger each day. This wasn't a hasty decision born of fear or loneliness. This was a choice made with full knowledge of what love cost and what it offered in return. The night before the wedding, Martha hosted a small gathering for Clara at the doctor's house. Just the women of Bear Creek who'd become her friends over the past months, sharing stories and advice and laughter that came from the bone-deep knowledge of what it meant to build a life on the frontier. "Marriage is work," Mrs. Henley said, her usual briskness softened by affection. "Anyone who tells you different is selling something, but it's good work if you've got the right partner." "Ethan's a good man," the blacksmith's wife added. "Patient and kind, but strong when he needs to be. You picked well, Clara." "Or he picked well," Martha corrected with a smile. "Our Clara here is quite the catch. Smart, brave, good with children, and stubborn enough to keep a lawman on his toes." Clara laughed, feeling warmed by the affection in the room. These women had welcomed her when she had nothing, had helped her build a life in this small town, had become the family she'd never quite had before. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you, for making me feel like I belong here." "You do belong here," Martha said firmly. "You've earned your place 100 times over, and tomorrow you're making it permanent." The wedding took place on a Saturday morning in early May, with the whole town gathered in the small church. Clara walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she didn't feel alone. Her students lined the pews, their faces bright with joy. The women who'd become her friends watched with tears in their eyes. And at the front of the church, Ethan stood waiting in a new suit, Jamie beside him looking proud and nervous in equal measure. When Clara reached the front and took Ethan's hands, Judge Cartwright smiled at them both. "Dearly beloved," he began, and Clara felt the words wash over her like a benediction. The vows were traditional, the promises ancient and tested by time. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do us part. Clara spoke them clearly, her voice steady, and watched Ethan's eyes fill with emotion as he repeated them back to her. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Cartwright declared. "Ethan, you may kiss your bride." And he did, there in front of everyone, a kiss that was both chaste and charged with promise. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Clara laughed against Ethan's mouth, dizzy with happiness. The reception at Mrs. Henley's was a joyful chaos of food and music and dancing. Clara's students performed a song they'd learned specially for the occasion, slightly off-key but enthusiastic. Tom Garrett gave a toast that was surprisingly heartfelt, talking about how Bear Creek had gained not just a teacher, but a pillar of the community. And through it all, Ethan kept Clara close, his hand at her waist or his fingers intertwined with hers, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. As the afternoon wore into evening and guests began to drift away, Clara found herself standing on Mrs. Henley's porch with Ethan, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Happy?" Ethan asked, pulling her back against his chest. "Happier than I knew was possible," Clara admitted. "When I got on that stagecoach 6 months ago, I thought I was just traveling to a new teaching position. I had no idea I was traveling toward home." "We're going to have a good life together," Ethan said, and it wasn't a question or even a promise. It was simply a statement of fact. "We're going to build something that lasts." "We already have." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "We built it with every choice to stay, every promise kept, every moment we chose each other, even when it was scary." Ethan kissed her forehead, tender and reverent. "I love you, Mrs. Cole." "I love you too." And saying it felt like coming home, like finally understanding what all the songs and poems had been trying to tell her. Love wasn't about fireworks or grand gestures. It was about this, standing with someone as the sun set, knowing that tomorrow you'd wake up and choose them again, and the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as you both lived. They'd rented a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs. As they walked toward it through the gathering darkness, Clara thought about all the paths that had led her here, the loss of her parents, the lonely years with her aunt, the teaching positions that never quite felt right, the terrible day of the stagecoach attack, the decision to stay in Bear Creek instead of running. Every choice, every heartbreak, every moment of fear or courage had been leading her here. To this man, this town, this life that felt both hard-won and inevitable. Inside their new home, Ethan lit lamps while Clara stood in the center of the main room and looked around. Their furniture was mostly borrowed or secondhand, but it was arranged with care, books on the shelves, curtains at the windows, a quilt on the bed that Martha had made as a wedding gift. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, coming to stand beside her. "I'm thinking about Emily Brennan," Clara said honestly, "about how her last act was to make sure Sarah would be loved and protected, about how that one request led to everything else. Staying in Bear Creek, meeting you, building this life. She couldn't have known what would come from that promise, but she trusted me anyway. And you honored that trust." Ethan's arm came around her shoulders. "You kept your promise, Clara. Sarah's safe and loved because of you." "We kept our promise," Clara corrected. "You helped just as much as I did. You've been helping ever since." "Then we'll keep helping." Ethan turned her to face him, his expression serious. "We'll build a life that honors what Emily gave us. We'll raise our children, when they come, to understand that promises matter, and staying matters, and love is something you choose every single day." "Children," Clara repeated, testing the weight of the word. "You want children?" "Eventually, if you do, but there's no rush." Ethan's smile was soft. "We have time, Clara. We have all the time in the world." But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Life was fragile, time was precious, and nothing was guaranteed. Emily Brennan had taught them that, had paid for that lesson with her life, which was exactly why they needed to make every day count. Clara reached up and pulled Ethan's face down to hers, kissing him with all the love and promise and fierce determination she felt. This was her husband, her partner, her future, and she was done being afraid of what that meant. "Take me to bed, Ethan Cole," she whispered against his mouth. "Take me to bed and show me what forever looks like." And he did, carrying her into their bedroom like she weighed nothing, laying her down on their marriage bed with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. Their first night together was everything it should have been, tender and passionate, awkward and perfect, full of whispered promises and shared laughter and the bone-deep knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. Afterward, Clara lay in Ethan's arms and listened to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. Outside, the Montana night was vast and star-filled, full of possibility and promise. Tomorrow she would wake up as Clara Cole, wife and teacher, member of this community, builder of this life. But tonight, she was simply Clara, loved and loving, held safe in the arms of a good man who taught her that staying was braver than running and that the hardest promises were always the ones most worth keeping. "I'm glad I stayed," she whispered into the darkness. Ethan's arms tightened around her. "So am I. So am I." And in the weeks and months that followed, as spring turned to summer and summer to fall, they proved it every single day. in the small kindnesses and large sacrifices, in the laughter and the hard conversations, in the way they built their life together brick by brick, promise by promise. Clara's school grew, adding more students as word spread about the quality of education she provided. Tommy announced he wanted to become a lawyer someday, someone who fought for justice like Ethan did, but with words instead of guns. Jamie learned to read so well that Clara started letting him help teach the younger children. The blacksmith's daughters discovered a love of mathematics that surprised everyone, including themselves. And through it all, Clara and Ethan built something that lasted. Not because it was easy, but because they'd both learned that the best things never are. They fought sometimes, about money or time or the 100 small frustrations that came with sharing a life. But they always came back together, always chose each other, always remembered that what they had was worth protecting. On their 6-month anniversary, Ethan came home to find Clara sitting at the kitchen table with a strange expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, always attuned to her moods. "Nothing's wrong." Clara stood and took his hands, placing them on her still flat stomach. "Everything's right. We're going to have a baby, Ethan. We're going to be parents." The joy that broke across his face was like sunrise, warm and full of light. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight, and Clara held on tight and thought about promises and futures and the way love multiplied instead of divided. They would name their daughter Emily when she arrived the following spring, not to replace the woman who'd died, but to honor her, to remember that sometimes the hardest moments of our lives lead directly to the most beautiful ones. And Sarah Brennan, growing up safe and loved in Helena with her father, would never know that she had a namesake in Bear Creek. But Clara would know, and she would tell her daughter, when Emily was old enough to understand, about the woman who'd made a choice in her final moments that changed everything, about staying when running would be easier, about keeping promises even when they cost you everything, about the way love persists, even through death and loss and all the 1,000 ways the world tries to break us. Because that was the lesson Clara had learned and the legacy she intended to pass on, that we honor the people we've lost by living fully, by building something beautiful from the broken pieces, by choosing, every single day, to stay and to love, and to keep the promises that make us human. Clara's pregnancy progressed through the summer like a secret she and Ethan shared with the world. Her body changed gradually, her dresses letting out at the waist, her face taking on the particular glow that came with growing life. The children at school noticed before anyone said anything official, their eyes tracking to her middle with the unfiltered curiosity of the young. "Miss Cole, are you getting fat?" one of the younger boys asked during arithmetic one sweltering August afternoon, and the entire classroom held its breath. Clara set down her chalk and turned to face her students with perfect composure. "I'm having a baby," she said simply. "Next spring, you'll all have a new little person in town to help look after." The explosion of questions that followed made her laugh. Would it be a boy or girl? Would the baby come to school? Could they help name it? Would Miss Cole still be their teacher? "Yes," Clara answered that last question firmly. "I'll still be your teacher. Having a baby doesn't change who I am or what I do. It just means I'll be doing it with a little one nearby." Tommy raised his hand tentatively. "My ma said having babies is dangerous, that lots of women die from it." The classroom went silent again, the other children suddenly remembering Emily Brennan, the woman whose death had brought their teacher to Bear Creek in the first place. Clara felt the weight of that memory settle over the room like a shroud. "Your mother's right," she said carefully. "Childbirth can be dangerous, but I have Dr. Patterson to help me, and Martha who's delivered dozens of babies, and a husband who won't let anything happen to me if he can help it." She smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "Besides, I'm too stubborn to let something like this defeat me." But that night, lying in bed with Ethan's hand spread protectively over her growing belly, Clara let herself acknowledge the fear she'd been keeping carefully contained. Women did die in childbirth, especially out here where medical care was limited, and complications could turn deadly in minutes. Emily Brennan had survived giving birth only to die months later from a bullet, but she could just as easily have died bringing Sarah into the world, leaving her daughter motherless from the very beginning. "You're thinking too loud," Ethan murmured against her hair. "I can hear your mind working from here." "I'm scared," Clara admitted. Not terrified, not paralyzed, just aware of what could go wrong. "Doctor," Patterson says you're healthy, strong, that everything looks exactly as it should. I know, but knowing doesn't always help, does it? Clara turned in his arms to face him in the darkness. Emily was healthy too, until she wasn't. Life can change in a heartbeat, Ethan. We both know that better than most. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. When I was tracking the Garretts, before I found you, I came across a homestead they'd hit 3 days earlier. Family of 5, mother, father, 3 children under 10. The Garretts had killed the parents and left the children alive, probably figuring they'd die on their own without anyone to care for them. Clara's breath caught. What happened to them? I got them to the nearest town, found family willing to take them in. But Clara, those children, they were so young, so scared, and they'd watched their parents die. The oldest was 8, and she kept trying to take care of the younger ones, kept saying it was her job now because Mama was gone. His voice roughened. It broke something in me, seeing that. Made me realize how fragile everything is, how quickly the people we love can be taken from us. That's not helping my fear, Clara said, but her hand found his in the darkness and held tight. I'm getting to the point, Ethan promised. Those children, they survived. They were devastated and traumatized, and their lives would never be the same, but they survived. Because the oldest girl refused to give up, refused to let fear win. She kept them alive through sheer determination until help came. He pulled Clara closer. You've got that same strength in you, Clara, that same refusal to let the hard things defeat you. So yes, childbirth is dangerous. Yes, things could go wrong, but I believe in you, believe in your strength, and I'm going to be right there beside you through all of it. Clara pressed her face against his chest and let his certainty wash over her. She wasn't alone in this. She had Ethan, had Martha, and Dr. Patterson, had a whole town of people who'd proven they cared about her. And she had herself, Clara Whitfield Cole, who'd stayed in a killing field to keep a promise, who'd rebuilt a broken school with her bare hands, who'd chosen love over safety, and built a life worth having. All right, she whispered. All right. I can do this. We can do this, Ethan corrected. Together. Fall arrived with crisp mornings and leaves that turned the mountainsides into paintings. Clara continued teaching, though she tired more easily now and had to sit during lessons that used to find her on her feet. Her students adapted without complaint, bringing her water and adjusting their schedules around her needs, with a thoughtfulness that made her eyes sting with emotion. Jamie, now 9 and reading at a level that would put most adults to shame, had taken to stopping by the house after school to help with chores. Ethan had started teaching him basic lawman skills, how to track, how to read signs, how to think through problems logically. Clara watched them together and saw the relationship deepening into something that looked very much like father and son. You're good with him, she told Ethan one evening after Jamie had left, his arms full of books Clara had lent him. He's a good kid, smart, eager to learn, respectful. Ethan was cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, the familiar ritual of checking and maintaining his tools. His aunt and uncle do their best, but they've got their own children to worry about. I think Jamie likes having someone pay attention to just him. You're not just paying attention, Clara observed. You're mentoring him. Training him even. Ethan looked up from his work, his expression thoughtful. Would that bother you, if I was? No, I think it's wonderful. Clara moved to stand behind him, her hands on his shoulders. I think every child deserves someone who believes in them the way you believe in Jamie, the way you believed in me. That's different. You're my wife. I'm supposed to believe in you. You believed in me before I was your wife, before you even knew my name. Clara leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. That's what makes you who you are, Ethan Cole. You see potential in people, and you help them become what they're capable of being. Winter came early that year, snow falling in October and staying through November. Clara's belly grew round and heavy, making simple tasks difficult and sleep nearly impossible. She was perpetually uncomfortable, her back aching and her feet swelling, but she refused to complain. This discomfort was temporary, a necessary price for the miracle growing inside her. In December, a letter arrived from Samuel Brennan. Clara opened it with shaking hands, always slightly anxious about what news it might bring. But Brennan's words were warm and full of life. Sarah was thriving, he wrote, talking in full sentences now, and showing signs of her mother's intelligence and kindness. He'd met a woman, a widow with a son of her own, and they were courting. He wanted Clara to know that he was finally able to think about Emily without the grief crushing him, finally able to imagine a future that included joy alongside the memories of loss. She would have wanted this, Brennan wrote. Emily would have wanted me to find happiness again, to give Sarah a mother and a brother. And I have you to thank for showing me what that kind of love looks like. The kind that stays, the kind that keeps promises even when it's hard. You gave me a gift when you protected Sarah, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Cole, I should say now, congratulations on your marriage. You gave me time to grieve and heal while knowing my daughter was safe. I'll never forget that. The letter included a small photograph, new technology that was becoming more common even in frontier towns. Clara stared at the image of a smiling toddler with dark curls and Emily's eyes, and felt tears stream down her face. She's beautiful, Ethan said softly, looking over Clara's shoulder at the photograph. She's alive, Clara whispered. Happy and alive and growing up surrounded by love. That's all Emily wanted. That's all any parent wants. Ethan's hand came to rest on Clara's belly, where their own child was moving beneath her skin. That's what we'll give ours too, love and safety and the knowledge that they matter. Christmas that year was quiet but perfect. Clara was too pregnant to do much celebrating, but the town brought the celebration to her. Martha organized a dinner at the Cole house, with neighbors bringing food and gifts and enough warmth to chase away the bitter cold outside. Jamie gave Clara a bookmark he'd made himself, carefully lettered with a quote from one of the books she'd lent him. Tommy presented her with a carved wooden toy he'd made in his father's workshop, meant for the baby. I figured every kid needs toys, he said gruffly, embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. And I wanted to make something useful. Clara hugged him, not caring that his face turned red or that the other children giggled. It's perfect, Tommy. The baby's going to love it. As winter deepened into January and then February, Clara felt time both speed up and slow down. Each day brought her closer to the moment when she'd hold her child, but also closer to the danger that childbirth represented. She tried not to think about it, tried to focus on preparing, sewing tiny clothes, organizing the cradle Ethan had built, going over plans with Martha and Dr. Patterson. But fear had a way of creeping in during the quiet moments, usually late at night when she couldn't sleep and the baby was pressing against her ribs, and she felt simultaneously more alive and more vulnerable than ever before. What if something goes wrong? She asked Ethan one of those nights, her voice small in the darkness. Then we'll deal with it, he said simply. Together, like we deal with everything else. But what if I... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that she might die and leave him alone. Leave their child motherless like Sarah. You won't, Ethan said fiercely, pulling her as close as her belly would allow. You won't, Clara, because I won't let you. I didn't find you just to lose you. I didn't build this life just to watch it fall apart. You can't promise that. No one can promise that. Maybe not, but I can promise that I'll fight for you with everything I have, that Dr. Patterson and Martha will do the same, that you won't face this alone. He pressed his forehead against hers. And I can promise that if the worst happens, which it won't, I'll make sure our child knows exactly who their mother was. What you sacrificed, what you stood for, how brave and stubborn and impossibly good you are. Clara cried then, hormones and fear and love all tangled together, and Ethan held her until the tears passed and exhaustion finally pulled her under into fitful sleep. The contractions started on a mild morning in late March, almost exactly a year after Clara had first arrived in Bear Creek. She was at the schoolhouse teaching her students about the westward expansion when the first pain caught her mid-sentence and made her gasp. Jamie was on his feet instantly. Miss Cole? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Clara managed, gripping the edge of her desk. But I think you all need to go home early today. Tommy, run and get Martha Patterson. Jamie, find Marshal Cole and tell him it's time. The children scattered like startled birds, some running for help, others racing home to spread the news. Within minutes, the whole town knew that Clara Cole was in labor. Martha arrived first, bustling in with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times. She took one look at Clara and nodded approvingly. Good color, good breathing. You're doing fine, Martha declared. Let's get you home and settled before things get serious." Ethan appeared as they were leaving the schoolhouse, his face pale but determined. "Clara, I'm fine," she said, then gasped as another contraction hit, stronger than the first. "Or I will be. Take me home, Ethan." The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and pressure, and Martha's steady voice coaching her through each wave. Dr. Patterson came and went, checking her progress, assuring Ethan that everything was proceeding normally. But normal didn't feel normal when your body was tearing itself apart to bring new life into the world. Clara had thought she understood pain. She'd survived grief and loss and the trauma of watching people die. But this was different, primal, and overwhelming, pain with a purpose that both terrified and strengthened her. "You're doing beautifully," Martha kept saying, "strong and steady, just like I knew you'd be." Ethan stayed by her side despite Martha's suggestions that he might be more comfortable waiting elsewhere. He held Clara's hand through every contraction, wiped her face with cool cloths, whispered encouragement that she barely heard over the roaring in her ears. "I can't do this," Clara gasped at one point, when the pain seemed endless and unbearable. "I can't, Martha. I can't." "You can, and you are," Martha said firmly. "You're almost there, Clara, just a little more." And then Dr. Patterson was saying something about pushing, and Martha was coaching her through it, and Ethan was telling her she was the bravest person he'd ever known. Clara gathered every scrap of strength she had left and bore down, pushing with everything she had, determined to meet this child she'd been carrying for 9 months. The baby's first cry was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. "A girl," Dr. Patterson announced, and suddenly there was a tiny, red-faced, perfect human being placed on Clara's chest, still connected by the cord but already so completely her own person. Clara looked down at her daughter, at Emily, named for a woman who'd died so this moment could happen, and felt something in her chest crack open. Love flooded in, fiercer and more overwhelming than anything she'd ever felt. A love that made every fear worthwhile and every moment of pain seem insignificant. "Hello, sweetheart," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Hello, Emily. We've been waiting for you." Ethan was crying, she realized dimly. Her strong, steady lawman husband had tears streaming down his face as he looked at their daughter, as he reached out with one gentle finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. "She's perfect," he said roughly. "Clara, she's absolutely perfect." "She is," Clara agreed, and couldn't stop staring at this miracle they'd made. This new life that represented hope and promise, and the future all wrapped up in one tiny, wrinkled package. Dr. Patterson and Martha took over then, cleaning the baby, delivering the afterbirth, checking to make sure Clara was healing properly. Everything was fine, they assured her. No complications, no excessive bleeding, a textbook delivery. Clara had done exactly what she needed to do, and now she just needed to rest and recover. But Clara couldn't rest, couldn't look away from Emily's face. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused eyes, taking in her first glimpses of the world. So small, Clara thought. So vulnerable and dependent and completely trusting that they would keep her safe. "I promise," Clara whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "I promise to love you and protect you and teach you what matters. I promise to show you that staying is braver than running, that keeping promises matters, that love is something you choose every single day. I promise to be the mother you deserve." It was a promise she knew she'd spend the rest of her life keeping. The days after Emily's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding and the particular exhaustion that came with caring for a newborn. But Clara had never been happier. She sat in the rocking chair Ethan had made, nursing Emily while watching the spring sunshine stream through the windows, and felt a contentment so complete it was almost frightening. The town rallied around them the way frontier communities did. Martha stopped by daily to check on both mother and baby. Mrs. Henley brought meals that only needed warming. The children from school made cards and drawings to decorate Emily's room. And Jamie appointed himself the baby's official protector, spending hours sitting beside the cradle and reading aloud from the books Clara had given him. "You're going to be so smart," Jamie told Emily during one of these sessions, his young voice serious. "Miss Cole's going to teach you everything, and you're going to read before you can even walk. And Marshal Cole's going to teach you to track and shoot and be brave. You're the luckiest baby in Montana territory." Clara, listening from the doorway, felt tears prick her eyes. Jamie had lost his own parents young, had been raised by relatives who loved him but were stretched thin with their own responsibilities. In Emily, he'd found someone to care for, someone to protect. And in return, Emily would grow up with a big brother who chose her out of love rather than obligation. When Emily was 2 weeks old, Clara wrote to Samuel Brennan, enclosing a photograph of the baby that the traveling photographer had taken. She told him about the birth, about naming their daughter after the woman whose sacrifice had brought Clara to Bear Creek in the first place. She told him that Emily Brennan's legacy lived on, not just in Sarah, but in this new life that bore her name. Brennan's response came quickly, full of warmth and emotion. He wrote that Emily would have been honored, that nothing would have made her happier than knowing her final act had led to so much love in life. He wrote that he and his new wife had married, that Sarah called her stepmother Mama without forgetting her first mother, that love had a way of multiplying rather than dividing when you let it. "We're building something good here," Brennan wrote. "A family forged from loss but defined by love, just like you and Marshall Cole have done. Emily would be so proud of what came from her choice to trust you with Sarah. I hope you'll tell your daughter, when she's old enough, about the woman she's named for, about how one act of courage in the face of death changed everything for all of us." Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it away in the box where she kept all of Brennan's correspondence. Someday, when Emily was old enough to understand, Clara would show her these letters, would tell her the whole story of the stagecoach attack and the dying woman and the promise that had changed everything, would teach her that the choices we make in our hardest moments define who we become. Spring turned to summer, and Emily grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert baby who smiled at everyone and grabbed at everything within reach. Claire returned to teaching part-time, bringing Emily to school with her and letting the older students help care for her during lessons. The children adored having a baby in the classroom, and Emily seemed to thrive on all the attention. Tommy, now 13 and shooting up like a weed, was surprisingly gentle with Emily, holding her carefully and making faces to get her to laugh. "I've got 5 younger siblings," he explained when Clara commented on his skill. "I know how to handle babies." "You're going to make a wonderful father someday," Clara told him, and watched his face flush with pleasure at the compliment. Jamie was equally devoted, but in a different way. He read to Emily constantly, showing her picture books and explaining what everything was, even though she was far too young to understand. "She's learning," he insisted when Ethan gently teased him about it. "Babies learn from hearing words even if they don't know what they mean yet. Miss Cole taught me that." Watching the 2 boys with her daughter, Clara felt a fierce pride in what she'd built. Not just the school or the marriage or the family, but the community. The network of people who cared for each other, who showed up in hard times, who proved every day that civilization was possible even in the wildest places. In August, on the anniversary of the day Clara and Ethan had first had dinner together at Mrs. Henley's, Ethan took Clara and Emily on a picnic by the creek. He'd packed a basket with all of Clara's favorite foods, spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree, and was clearly working up to something. "What is it?" Clara asked, nursing Emily while watching her husband pace nervously. "You look like you're about to tell me something terrible." "Not terrible, just big." Ethan sat down beside her, his hands restless. "The territorial marshal's office contacted me. They want me to take a promotion, become the regional supervisor. It would mean better pay, more stability, less time in the field chasing outlaws." Clara's heart leapt and sank simultaneously. "That sounds wonderful. Why do you look worried about it?" "Because it would mean moving to Helena, leaving Bear Creek." Ethan finally met her eyes. "Leaving everything you've built here." Clara looked down at Emily, who had fallen asleep at her breast, milk-drunk and peaceful. She thought about her students, about the school that had gone from broken and abandoned to thriving, about the friendship she'd formed, the life she'd created from nothing. "What do you want to do?" she asked Ethan. "Not what you think I want, not what makes the most sense financially. What do you want?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I want to stay here. I want to raise Emily in this town, with these people. I want her to grow up knowing Jamie and Tommy and all your students. I want her to learn from you what it means to be brave and stubborn and good." He paused. "But I also want to provide for my family, Want to make sure you and Emily have everything you need." "We already have everything we need," Claire said softly. "We have each other, we have a home, we have a community that cares about us. Money is just money, Ethan. It can't buy what we've built here." "So we stay?" "We stay," Clara confirmed. "We put down roots and we grow them deep. We show Emily what it means to choose a place and commit to it, to be part of something bigger than yourself." The relief on Ethan's face was palpable. "I was hoping you'd say that. I already told them no, but I wanted to make sure we were making the decision together." Clara laughed, shifting Emily to her shoulder to burp her. "You already turned them down?" "I wasn't going to uproot our family for a job, no matter how good it looked on paper." Ethan leaned over and kissed Clara's forehead. "You taught me that, Clara, that staying matters, that the easy path isn't always the right one." As summer faded into fall and Emily celebrated her first birthday with a party that involved half the town, Clara found herself reflecting on how much had changed in 2 years. She'd gone from a solitary woman with no family and no prospects to a wife and mother with deep roots in a community she loved. She'd gone from running from place to place, never quite belonging, to choosing to stay and build something that lasted. And Emily, bright, curious, already trying to form words, would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved. Would never have to wonder if she mattered, because every day Clara and Ethan and the whole town of Bear Creek showed her that she did. On a crisp October morning, exactly 2 years after the stagecoach attack, Clara took Emily to visit the small cemetery on the hill above town. She'd never been here before, had never felt ready, but something about the anniversary made her want to acknowledge what had been lost along with what had been gained. There was no grave for Emily Brennan here. Her body had been buried in Helena, near her family. But Clara had commissioned a small marker anyway, a simple stone that read, "In memory of Emily Brennan, whose final act of courage changed everything. 1869 to 1895. Her legacy lives on." Clara sat on the grass beside the marker with Emily in her lap and told her daughter the story for the first time, about a woman on a stagecoach who'd been shot by bad men, who'd died slowly but used her last hours to make sure her baby daughter would be safe. About the promise Clara had made and the choice to stay when running would have been easier. Emily was too young to understand the words, but she sat quietly as if she knew this was important, her small hand patting Clara's arm in unconscious comfort. "You're named after a hero," Clara told her daughter, "after a woman who loved her child so much that even dying couldn't stop her from protecting her. And I want you to grow up knowing that kind of love is real, that people really do sacrifice everything for the ones they care about, that promises really do matter, even when they're hard to keep." Emily babbled something that might have been agreement, and Clara hugged her close, breathing in the sweet baby smell of her, and feeling grateful for every moment that had led to this one. When they got home, Ethan was waiting on the porch with Jamie, both of them working on repairing the fence that surrounded their small yard. Emily squealed with delight at seeing them and reached her arms out, wanting her father. Ethan scooped her up, tossing her gently in the air and catching her while she shrieked with laughter. "How was the cemetery?" "Peaceful," Clara said, settling onto the porch step beside Jamie. "Necessary. I think I needed to say goodbye properly, to acknowledge what was lost even while being grateful for what was gained." "Emily Brennan was brave," Jamie said quietly, not looking up from the fence post he was sanding. "What she did, making sure Sarah was protected even though she was dying, that was the bravest thing I've ever heard of." "Bravery comes in a lot of forms," Clara agreed. "Sometimes it's dramatic, like what Emily did, but sometimes it's quieter. Like a boy who chooses to educate himself even when it would be easier not to. Like a man who takes a job tracking criminals because someone needs to protect the innocent. Like choosing to stay and build something instead of running when things get hard." Jamie finally looked up, his young face serious beyond his years. "Is that why you stayed in Bear Creek? After the attack, when you could have left?" "Partly. I stayed because I'd promised to protect Sarah until her father could claim her. But I also stayed because Marshal Cole asked me to, and something about the way he asked made me want to see what staying might feel like." Clara glanced at Ethan, who was listening while playing with Emily. "Turns out staying feels like home." "I'm glad you stayed," Jamie said. "Things are better with you here. The school, the town, everything. It's like you showed up and reminded everyone that things could be good if we worked for it." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. This boy, who'd barely been able to read when she'd arrived, who'd had so little confidence in his own potential, was now articulate and thoughtful and well on his way to becoming an extraordinary man. "You did the work yourself, Jamie. I just showed you what was possible." "That's what good teachers do," Ethan said, coming to sit beside Clara with Emily still in his arms. "They show people what they're capable of becoming, then get out of the way and let them become it." That winter was the coldest anyone could remember, with snow piling so high that travel between towns became nearly impossible. But the Cole house was warm and full of life. Emily took her first steps in December, walking from Clara to Ethan and back again while they cheered her on. She learned to say Mama and Papa and JJ, which was as close as she could get to Jamie's name. Clara taught through the worst of the weather, sometimes with only a handful of students who lived close enough to make the journey. But they came, determined and committed, because she'd taught them that education mattered and they'd believed her. Tommy brought news one February afternoon that his father had died in an accident at the ranch. Clara watched the boy struggle with complicated grief, sadness for the loss, but also relief that he'd no longer be pressured to follow in footsteps that had never fit him. "He wasn't a bad man," Tommy said to Clara after school one day, his voice thick with unshed tears. He had ideas about who I should be, and they weren't who I wanted to be." "You can mourn him and still choose your own path," Clara said gently. "Those things don't contradict each other. You can love him for being your father while refusing to repeat his mistakes." "Is that what you do with your parents?" Clara thought about her mother and father, dead for so many years now, about her cold aunt who'd done her duty without affection. "I honor what my parents gave me while building something different. That's all any of us can do. Take the good, leave the bad, and try to be better than the generation before us." Tommy nodded slowly. "I want to be better. I want to be the kind of man people respect because of what I do, not because they're afraid of me." "Then that's who you'll be," Clara said with certainty. "Because you're choosing it, and the choices we make define us more than the circumstances we're born into." Spring came again, bringing Emily's second birthday and another crop of students to the school. Clara was pregnant again, just barely showing, carrying this second child with more confidence than the first. Emily was a whirlwind of toddler energy, into everything and afraid of nothing, talking in full sentences that often made the adults around her laugh with their precocious wisdom. "Mama, why is the sky blue?" Emily asked one afternoon while they were walking home from school. Clara started to give a simple answer, then stopped. Emily was smart enough for the truth. "The sky isn't really blue," she explained. "It's all the colors of light mixed together, but our eyes see mostly blue because of how the light scatters in the air." Emily considered this seriously. "So, things aren't always what they look like." "Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. That's why it's important to ask questions and learn what's really true, instead of just accepting what you see on the surface." Like how people thought Miss Emily was just a lady on a stagecoach, but really she was a hero? Clara's breath caught. They'd told Emily the story of her namesake several times now, and the child had absorbed it completely. "Yes, exactly like that. People are often more than they appear to be. That's why it's important to look deeper, to see who they really are." "Am I more than I appear to be?" The question, so earnest and philosophical from a 2-year-old, made Clara's heart ache with love. "You're exactly what you appear to be, a smart, brave, curious little girl. But you're also everything you're going to become. A student, and a teacher, a daughter, and someday maybe a mother, a person who makes choices that matter. All of that is in you already, just waiting to grow." Emily seemed satisfied with this answer, skipping ahead on the path while chattering to herself about colors and heroes and all the things she was going to be when she grew up. That summer, Clara gave birth to a son they named James, after Jamie Patterson, who'd become so much a part of their family. The birth was easier than Emily's had been, and James was a quiet, contemplative baby who seemed content to watch the world rather than immediately trying to conquer it like his sister had. Jamie himself, now 11 and tall enough to look adults in the eye, was overcome when they told him about the name. "You named him after me?" His voice cracked with emotion. "Really?" "Your family," Ethan said simply. "You've been family since the day you started coming around, helping Clara with chores and learning to track. This just makes it official. Jamie looked at the tiny baby in Clara's arms, his face working through emotions too big for words. I promise I'll be the best big brother, he finally managed. I'll teach him everything I know. I'll protect him and Emily both. We know you will, Clara said warmly. That's why we chose your name. As James grew from infant to baby to toddler, the Cole household became organized chaos. Emily was in school now, sitting in her mother's classroom and learning alongside children twice her age. James was walking and getting into everything, curious and determined in his quiet way. And Clara was pregnant again, carrying their third child with the calm acceptance of a woman who'd done this before and knew what to expect. Tommy graduated from Clara's school at 16, the first student she'd taught from beginning to end. He'd been accepted to a law program in San Francisco, his intelligence and dedication earning him a scholarship that would pay his way. I wouldn't be here without you, Tommy told Clara at his graduation ceremony, which the whole town attended. You showed me that I could be more than what I was born to, that my choices mattered more than my circumstances. You did the work yourself, Clara said, but she was crying as she hugged him goodbye. I just showed you the door. You're the one who walked through it. I'm going to come back, Tommy promised. When I'm done with school, when I'm a real lawyer, I'm going to come back to Montana and help people the way you and Marshall Cole helped me. I'm going to be part of making this place better. And he did. Years later, Thomas Webb would return to Montana as a lawyer specializing in defending the rights of small ranchers against the big cattle companies. He'd argue cases all the way to the territorial Supreme Court, winning landmark decisions that protected homesteaders and ensured fair treatment under the law. And he'd always credit Clara Cole, the teacher who'd believed in him when no one else did, as the person who'd changed his life. But that was still years in the future. In the present, Clara had a classroom full of students to teach, 2 small children to raise, and a third on the way. She had a husband who still looked at her like she hung the moon, even after years of marriage and the exhaustion of parenthood. She had a community that valued her contributions and friends who showed up when she needed them. She had, in other words, exactly the life she'd always wanted but never quite believed was possible. On the 5th anniversary of the stagecoach attack, Clara stood at Emily Brennan's memorial stone with her whole family. Emily the younger was 7 now, reading at a level that astounded everyone and asking questions that sometimes stumped even her mother. James was 4, quiet and thoughtful, already showing signs of his father's tracking skills and patient observation. And baby Grace, named for no one in particular but everything good and beautiful in the world, was just 6 months old, sleeping peacefully in her father's arms. This is where our family really began, Clara told her children. Not when your father and I met, but when a woman I barely knew trusted me with the most important thing in her life. She showed me what real courage looked like, and she changed everything. Is that why we have to be brave? Emily asked, serious and intent. Because Miss Emily was brave? We have to be brave because life requires it, Claire said. Because hard things happen and we have to face them. But we can be brave because we've seen what courage looks like. We know it's possible, even in the worst moments, to choose love over fear. I choose love, James announced, which made everyone laugh because he said it so seriously, like he was making a vow. Good, Ethan said, adjusting Grace in his arms. That's always the right choice. As they walked back down the hill toward town, Clara looked at her family and felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. This was what Emily Brennan had died protecting. Not her own daughter specifically, but this. The continuation of love and life and hope. The proof that choosing to stay and fight and keep promises was worth it, even when the cost was high. Sarah Brennan would be 7 now, too, growing up in Helena with her father and stepmother and the baby brother they'd welcomed last year. Clara still exchanged letters with Samuel Brennan, trading stories about their children, marveling at how much life could change in just a few years. Sarah asks about you sometimes, Brennan had written in his last letter. She doesn't remember the stagecoach or her mother's death, thank heaven, but she knows the story. She knows that a brave woman named Miss Clara stayed with her mother and kept her safe until I could come for her. I tell her that's the kind of person she should aspire to be, someone who keeps promises, someone who stays. Clara had cried over that letter, as she cried over most of Brennan's correspondence. not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of knowing that a single choice, made in a moment of crisis, had rippled out to affect so many lives. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, Claire and Ethan sat on their porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd run?" Ethan asked. "If you'd left Sarah and gotten away from the stagecoach as fast as you could?" Clara considered the question seriously. "I wonder sometimes. I'd probably be teaching somewhere else, alone and lonely, still looking for a place to belong. I'd have survived, but I wouldn't have this." She gestured to the house, to the town, to everything they'd built. "I wouldn't have you or our children or this life. I'd have safety, but not purpose." "Do you regret it? The choice you made, knowing everything it's cost you?" "Cost me?" Clara turned to look at her husband in the fading light. "Ethan, that choice gave me everything. It gave me you and Emily and James and Grace. It gave me a home and a purpose and a family. Yes, I was terrified that day. Yes, I still have nightmares sometimes about the sound of gunfire and Emily Brennan's last breaths. But I'd make the same choice again without hesitation, because staying was the bravest thing I've ever done, and it led to the best things I've ever had." Ethan pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. "I love you," Ethan said eventually, "for staying when you could have run, for building this with me, for being exactly who you are." "I love you too," Claire replied, "for seeing me when I was just a stranger covered in blood, for believing I was worth protecting before you knew anything about me, for choosing this life with me every single day." They'd been married for almost 5 years now, but it still felt new every morning. Still felt like a choice they were making together, to stay and build and love, despite knowing how fragile it all was. Inside, Grace began to cry, needing to be fed. Clara stood, her body moving automatically toward the sound of her child's need, and Ethan followed. This was their life now: interrupted sleep and constant demands, small victories and daily exhaustion. But it was also laughter and growth, watching their children discover the world, seeing themselves reflected in 3 small faces that looked at them with trust and love. Years passed, as they always do. Emily grew into a brilliant young woman who went to college in the East, studying literature and philosophy, always planning to come back to Montana to teach. James became a deputy marshal like his father, tracking criminals and protecting the innocent with the same steady determination Ethan had shown. Grace became a doctor, studying in San Francisco and returning to open a practice in Bear Creek, caring for the same community that had helped raise her. Jamie Patterson went into law enforcement, becoming a U.S. Marshal and making a name for himself as one of the best trackers in the West. He married one of the blacksmith's daughters and had children of his own, children who called Clara and Ethan Grandma and Grandpa without hesitation, because family was about choice, not just blood. And Clara kept teaching, year after year, student after student. She saw children arrive, barely able to read, and leave ready for university. She watched them grow into adults who made the world better, who kept promises and stayed when running would be easier, who chose courage over comfort because she'd shown them it was possible. On her 70th birthday, the town threw her a celebration that brought people from all over the territory. Former students traveled from as far away as California and New York to honor the teacher who'd changed their lives. They brought their children and grandchildren, showing Clara the legacy she'd built through decades of patient instruction and unwavering belief in human potential. Tommy Webb was there, now a respected judge who'd shaped Montana law for the better. Jamie Patterson came with his whole family, presenting Clara with a plaque that read, "To the woman who taught us that staying matters, with love and gratitude from the students of Bear Creek School." And in the back of the crowd, Clara saw a young woman with dark curls and familiar eyes, standing with an older man who'd gone gray at the temples, but whose face she'd recognize anywhere. Sarah and Samuel Brennan had come. Clara made her way through the crowd, her heart pounding, and stood face to face with the baby she'd protected 35 years ago. "Mrs. Cole," Sarah said, and there were tears streaming down her face. "I had to come. I had to meet the woman who saved my life." "You don't remember me," Clara said, touching Sarah's face with gentle fingers. "You were just a baby." I don't remember you with my mind, Sarah agreed, but my father told me the story so many times that I feel like I do. He told me about my mother's courage and your promise, about how you stayed when you could have run, about how everything good in my life exists because you chose to protect a stranger's child. Your mother chose that, Clara said. I just honored her request. You did more than that. Samuel Brennan stepped forward, older now but still recognizable as the devastated young man who'd claimed his daughter all those years ago. You showed me what love looks like in its purest form. You helped me survive the worst loss of my life by giving me time to grieve while knowing Sarah was safe. I've tried to live up to that example, tried to show Sarah what it means to keep promises and stay when things get hard. They talked for hours, trading stories and memories, filling in the gaps of 3 decades. Sarah was married with children of her own, teaching school in Helena, carrying on the legacy of education and compassion in her own way. Samuel had remarried happily and lived a good life, always honoring Emily's memory while building something new and beautiful. My mother lives on in me, Sarah said at one point, in the choices I make, the way I treat people, the promises I keep. And you helped make that possible, Mrs. Cole. You gave me the chance to exist, to grow up, to become someone who tries to be worthy of what she sacrificed. After they left, Clara sat on the porch of her home with Ethan beside her, both of them old now but still choosing each other every day. Was it worth it? Ethan asked, echoing a question from decades ago. All of it. The fear and the pain and the hard work. Clara thought about Emily Brennan dying in the dirt, about Sarah growing up loved and protected, about her own children and grandchildren, about the hundreds of students whose lives she'd touched. She thought about promises kept and fears overcome, and the way a single choice in a moment of crisis could change everything. Yes, she said simply, every moment of it was worth it, because I chose to stay, and everything that mattered came from that choice. As the sun set on another Montana day, Clara Whitfield Cole closed her eyes and felt nothing but gratitude. She'd started as a woman with nothing, running from loneliness and searching for belonging. And she'd ended as a woman who'd built a legacy of love and learning, who'd shown countless people what it meant to stay and fight and choose courage over comfort. The stagecoach attack had been the worst day of her life, but it had also been the beginning of everything that made her life worth living. And in the end, that was the lesson she'd spent a lifetime teaching, that our hardest moments often lead to our most beautiful ones, that staying is always braver than running, and that the promises we keep, even when they cost us everything, are the ones that end up defining who we become. Claire had kept her promise to Emily Brennan, and in doing so, she'd found herself. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.